There are cases in the long annals of Sherlock Holmes's investigative career that resist easy categorization, matters that begin in obscurity and end in revelation so complete, so illuminating of the human condition in all its darkest corners, that Watson found himself returning to them in the quiet hours of old age with something very close to wonder. The affair of the Scarlet merchant was precisely such a case. It arose, as so many of Holmes's most celebrated investigations had a habit of doing, not from any direct solicitation of his talents, but from the collision of coincidence and observation, from that peculiar faculty Holmes possessed of seeing significance in the apparently mundane and reading catastrophe in what the ordinary eye dismissed as triviality. It was in the autumn of 1895, a season that had descended upon London with unusual severity. October had brought with it a damp, clinging cold that seemed to seep through brick and mortar alike, and the great city wore an air of premature winter. The fogs, which in those years before the gradual reformation of London's domestic hearths were a fixture of the autumn calendar as surely as falling leaves, had returned with renewed vigor, blanketing the streets in a yellowish murk that reduced the gas lamps to pale, trembling halos and turned every pedestrian into a muffled, indistinct shadow. Baker Street itself seemed to contract in this weather, the familiar outlines of its terraced houses softening into vague masses of stone and soot, and even the steady rumble of cab wheels and horse hooves on the cobbles below took on a muted, distant quality, as though the city were dreaming rather than waking. Watson had called upon Holmes that Tuesday morning with no particular agenda beyond companionship and the hope of escaping the boredom that had settled over his own practice during a week of unseasonal quiet. His medical work had been, with that perverse contrariness that seemed to govern such things, almost entirely undemanding of late, and he found himself with unaccustomed leisure on his hands, leisure which he spent partly in reading, partly in reviewing his notes on earlier cases, and partly in allowing himself to be drawn back to Baker Street and the inimitable company of his friend. The rooms at 221B had a quality he had never quite been able to articulate to his own satisfaction. They were simultaneously chaotic and purposeful, simultaneously oppressive with accumulated papers and specimens, and simultaneously alive with the possibility of imminent intellectual adventure. Holmes had not changed materially in the years since Watson had last regularly inhabited those rooms, though perhaps the lines of his face had sharpened slightly, and the grey that had begun to thread itself through his dark hair seemed more pronounced than Watson remembered. He sat that morning in his familiar armchair beside the fire, his long legs stretched before him, his chin resting upon steepled fingers, in that posture of concentrated inwardness which Watson had learned to interpret not as idleness but as its precise opposite, the outward stillness of a mind in furious motion. The morning papers lay scattered across the hearthrug in a state of archaeological disorder that suggested Holmes had read them in layers, abandoning each as it ceased to yield anything of interest and seizing upon the next. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Morning Post, all had been subjected to that peculiar velocity of attention which Holmes brought to any document that might contain a thread worth pulling. Watson, settling himself into the second armchair and pouring himself a cup of the coffee that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided, observed this familiar disorder with the affectionate tolerance of long acquaintance and permitted himself to read in silence for some minutes before Holmes, without altering his posture or opening his eyes, for he had closed them, as he sometimes did when thinking, made the observation that had Watson not come he would have been obliged to summon him. There was, of course, no dialogue in the way that word is ordinarily understood between them that morning. What passed between Holmes and Watson was always more than conversation, and Watson's later recollections of their exchanges were more impressionistic than stenographic, reflecting not so much the precise words as the quality and direction of Holmes's thought. What Watson grasped, settling forward in his chair with the instinctive alertness of a man who has learned to recognize the specific weight of Holmes's silences, was that something in the morning's papers had engaged his friend's attention with unusual force, and that the case, for it was already a case in Holmes's mind, Watson was certain, even if it was as yet no more than a set of suggestive fragments, was one of those that stirred in him the particular quality of anticipation that Watson associated with his finest investigations. The object of Holmes's attention was a small notice, barely 4 column inches, tucked into the inner pages of that morning's Times beneath the agglomeration of commercial intelligence and shipping news that formed the unremarkable midriff of that stately publication. It concerned the death of a man named Aldous Pemberton Farr, described as a merchant of considerable standing in the City of London, whose body had been discovered in the early hours of Monday morning in the vicinity of Bermondsey, specifically in one of those narrow, irregular streets that ran between the wharves and the tanning yards. The notice gave few details, noting only that Mr. Farr had apparently died of natural causes. A cardiac episode was suggested, and that his presence in Bermondsey at such an hour was, in the discreet language of newspaper journalism, unexplained. The notice was brief and would have escaped most readers' attention entirely, buried as it was amid weightier commercial concerns, but to Holmes, as Watson came to understand, it contained three elements that were individually suggestive and collectively irresistible. The first was the name itself, or rather not the name but the hyphenation of commercial significance it carried. Aldous Pemberton Farr was not unknown in certain circles of London's mercantile world. He had, over a period of some 15 years, accumulated a considerable reputation as a dealer in imported goods of a particular and specialized character: spices, dyes, rare botanical commodities from the Eastern trade. And his name appeared regularly enough in the commercial columns of the financial press for a man of Holmes's voracious reading habits to have encountered it more than once. What made the name notable was not mere commercial success, which was common enough in London's endlessly churning economy, but a particular transaction that had come to Holmes's attention some months previously in a context entirely unrelated to Mr. Farr's present end. The second element was geographical. Bermondsey was not Farr's world. His offices were in Mincing Lane, the great thoroughfare of the commodity trade, and his home, Holmes had verified this rapidly from memory and from a reference in one of the earlier notices he had clipped and preserved, was in Kensington. Bermondsey, with its leather yards, its peculiar combination of ancient poverty and industrial labour, its warren of streets running down to the river between London Bridge and Rotherheath, was a district in which a prosperous city merchant might have business interests but would rarely be found at 2 o'clock in the morning. The distance between these two worlds, the elegant late Victorian commerce of Mincing Lane and the ancient, malodorous industry of the Bermondsey wharves, was not merely geographical but social and temporal, and the question of what had bridged it on that particular night was one to which Holmes's mind had apparently attached itself with considerable force. The third element was the most delicate and in some respects the most suggestive of the three. The description of the cause of death as a probable cardiac episode was perfectly plausible for a man of Farr's age and station. He had been 63, of robust build, the sort of man who dines well and exercises little, and yet Holmes, with that perverse instinct for the anomalous which governed so much of his intellectual life, found something slightly too convenient in the attribution. Not that he had any evidence to contradict it, not yet. But there was a quality to the terseness of the newspaper notice, a kind of official reticence, that suggested the matter had not been entirely closed to the satisfaction of all parties, that there was more here than a straightforward if unfortunate death of natural causes in an inconvenient location. By the time Watson had absorbed these three elements and began to grasp the shape of Holmes's thinking, his friend had already risen from his armchair with that sudden, galvanic quality of movement that characterized his transitions from apparent torpor to action, and was directing his attention to a particular section of his index. That remarkable personal reference system, compiled over years of patient industry, which occupied several volumes of his bookshelf and which Watson had long regarded as one of the most extraordinary private documents in London. Holmes moved through this system with practiced ease, his fingers moving rapidly across the cards and slips that he had organized according to a classification system entirely his own, pausing occasionally to remove a slip and set it beside the open newspaper, until he had assembled before him a small collection of references that, taken together, apparently satisfied some preliminary condition of his investigation. What Watson could gather from the references that Holmes permitted him to examine was that Aldous Pemberton Farr had, approximately 8 months previously, been associated, tangentially but unmistakably, with a transaction involving a consignment of goods from a shipping company whose name appeared in Holmes's notes in connection with a quite different investigation, one that had concerned the disappearance of certain documents from a government office and had never been brought to a fully satisfactory conclusion. The connection was slight, barely more than a coincidence of names and dates, and Holmes himself was careful, as he always was in the earliest stages of an inquiry, to treat it as no more than a possible thread rather than an established link. but it was enough to send him to his coat and hat with the purposeful velocity that Watson had learned to interpret as the beginning of something significant. The morning air struck them as they emerged from 221B with a force that was almost physical, cold, damp, laden with coal smoke and the faint, pervasive smell of the river that followed London's fog wherever it went. Holmes set off along Baker Street at his characteristic pace, that long, rapid stride that had always obliged Watson to maintain a slight but continuous effort to keep up, and Watson fell in beside him with the comfortable familiarity of long practice, making no inquiry as to their destination because he had learned that Holmes would reveal it in his own time, and because there was a particular pleasure in these early morning departures, in the sense of being drawn into motion by the current of Holmes's intellect before one had fully thought about whether or where one wished to go. They took a cab from the rank at the top of Baker Street. Holmes's preference, when thinking, was for the relative privacy of a hansom rather than the bustle of the underground or the omnibus, and set off eastward through streets that were, at this hour, already committed to their day's work. London in the 1890s was a city that lived and breathed commerce, and the hours between 8 and 10 in the morning were ones of particular intensity. The great army of clerks and shopmen and office workers flowing eastward and cityward on foot and by omnibus and underground, the delivery carts jostling for position in the narrow streets, the flower sellers and newspaper vendors staking out their territories on corners and pavements, and above all this human motion the smoke ascending from a million chimneys, the great permanent weather system of the Victorian city. Watson watched all this from the window of the cab with the half-attention of a man who has seen it 1,000 times and yet never quite ceased to find it remarkable, while Holmes sat perfectly still beside him, his eyes apparently unfocused, his mind manifestly elsewhere. Their first destination was not Bermondsey but Mincing Lane, and specifically the offices of Farr, Calloway and Associates, which occupied the third floor of a solid Georgian building that had been refaced in the mid-century with a skin of Portland stone and given a dignity slightly in excess of its actual age. The building, like many in that quarter, combined the gravity of established commerce with a slight air of having been designed to impress rather than to be beautiful, its ground floor occupied by a shipping agent of the second rank and its upper floors divided among several firms whose names appeared on a brass plate of considerable size and considerable antiquity beside the main entrance. Holmes presented himself at the offices of Farr, Calloway with the quiet authority that he had always been able to assume when the occasion demanded it, an authority that owed nothing to theatrical display and everything to the peculiar intensity of his bearing, the quality of absolute purposeful intelligence that he projected and that most people found, without quite knowing why, difficult to resist or dismiss. He was admitted to the waiting room after a brief interval during which Watson could observe, through the frosted glass panels of the inner door, a certain amount of low-voiced consultation between clerks, consultation that had the specific texture of a firm whose senior partner has recently and unexpectedly died and which has not yet fully decided how to present itself to the world in that altered condition. The man who received them was Mr. James Calloway, the surviving partner, a man of perhaps 55, spare and precise in his movements, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now bore the particular compression of long commercial anxiety, the forehead slightly too creased, the mouth slightly too firmly set, the eyes habitually watchful in the manner of a man who has spent decades reading the faces across a negotiating table. He had the clothes and hands of a prosperous professional, good wool, carefully maintained, the nails manicured to a degree that suggested both personal vanity and a certain conception of how one ought to present oneself to clients, but there was something in his bearing that morning, a quality of controlled agitation, that suggested he had not slept well and that the precise, measured facade he presented required more effort than usual to maintain. Holmes's examination of Mr. Calloway was conducted with the characteristic indirection that he preferred at this stage of an investigation, a series of observations rather than direct interrogations, each apparently casual, each in fact precisely aimed. Watson, watching Holmes watch Calloway, was aware of the rapid, systematic quality of this attention, the way Holmes's gaze moved across the man's face and hands and clothing and the arrangement of his desk with the methodical thoroughness of a surveyor taking measurements, recording, comparing, drawing preliminary conclusions that he would later revise or confirm as further evidence accumulated. Watson himself noted the obvious signs. The slight puffiness around Calloway's eyes that spoke of a disturbed or sleepless night, the small nervous adjustment of a ring on his left hand that suggested an unease he was otherwise successfully containing, the singular neatness of the desk's surface, which in the office of a recently deceased senior partner suggested either that papers had been hastily put away or that someone had recently and thoroughly searched through them. The substance of Holmes's visit, as Watson later understood it, was threefold. He wished to establish the nature of Farr's recent business, and specifically whether any transaction or correspondence of unusual character had come to Calloway's knowledge in the weeks before the senior partner's death. He wished to understand the geography of Farr's movements on the day and evening before his body was discovered. And he wished, though this was the subtlest and in some ways the most important of the three, to form an impression of Calloway himself, of the kind of man he was and the quality and nature of his relationship with his late partner. This last was not idle biographical curiosity but a reflection of Holmes's conviction, formed from long experience, that in cases involving commercial men the partnership, its history, its tensions, its financial arrangements, its personal dynamics, was almost always germane to whatever crisis had produced the matter under investigation. What Holmes learned from this visit could not be reduced to a simple list of facts, for the most important elements of it were of the qualitative sort that resist enumeration. The specific flavor of Calloway's unease, the particular set of his shoulders when certain questions approached certain areas, the fractional delay before certain answers that revealed not dishonesty necessarily but the operation of judgment about how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. What was clear was that Calloway had known of no reason for Farr to be in Bermondsey on the night of his death, that he professed himself genuinely puzzled by the circumstance, and that this puzzlement, whether genuine or performed, was colored by something that Watson, watching carefully, would have described as apprehension rather than mere surprise. There was also the matter of a letter. Calloway mentioned it almost in passing, with the slight over-casualness of a man who has decided to mention something and has been rehearsing how to do so without giving it undue weight. A letter that had arrived for Farr some 3 weeks previously, addressed in an unfamiliar hand, which Farr had read in Calloway's presence and then placed immediately in his breast pocket, where it had remained. Calloway had thought nothing of this at the time, they were not in the habit of reading each other's correspondence. But he had noticed that Farr's manner for the remainder of that day had been slightly altered, slightly more inward and preoccupied than usual, and that he had cancelled 2 appointments that afternoon without explanation. The letter, needless to say, had not been found among Farr's papers or effects, which were currently in the hands of the city police. Holmes received this information with the perfect stillness that in him indicated the highest degree of attention, and Watson could see, from long experience of that stillness, that the mention of the letter had struck a particular chord in whatever pattern Holmes was beginning to construct. They took their leave of Calloway with the courtesy that Holmes always maintained with informants, regardless of what he privately thought of them, and descended to the street where the damp October air received them with its customary grey indifference. The next call was upon Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whom Holmes had telegraphed from Baker Street before they set out and who had agreed, with the mixture of wariness and curiosity that always characterized his dealings with Holmes, to meet them at the Yard. The relationship between Holmes and Lestrade was one of London's minor but enduring ironies, a collaboration between 2 men who held each other in the particular esteem of colleagues who are acutely conscious of each other's limitations and who have learned, through long experience, that their different approaches are more complementary than competitive, however much professional pride on both sides sometimes made them reluctant to admit it. Lestrade was, in Watson's estimation, a capable and energetic man of the second order, possessed of considerable practical courage and a thorough knowledge of the criminal world he inhabited professionally, but whose imagination, in the pejorative sense Holmes occasionally employed, meaning the capacity to entertain possibilities that lay outside the boundaries of established pattern, was somewhat limited. He respected Holmes without fully understanding him, and suspected him of an intellectual arrogance that was not entirely without foundation, and the 2 had maintained over the years a working relationship that served the ends of justice with reasonable reliability without ever resolving itself into genuine warmth. Lestrade had the Farr file, such as it was, at this early stage, and had clearly been considering it himself with some degree of puzzlement. The police's preliminary view was, as the newspaper had reported, a probable cardiac episode, an inconvenient location, and a set of circumstances that were more embarrassing than alarming. The kind of embarrassment that attached to a prosperous middle-aged man found dead in Bermondsey in the small hours did not necessarily require explanation by foul play. London's history offered a sufficient number of precedents for the terminal consequences of discreet nocturnal excursions into neighbourhoods below one's station. But there were elements that had given Lestrade pause, and which he shared with Holmes in the somewhat reluctant manner of a man who knows he is going to be told he has not thought hard enough about what he is looking at. The medical examination, conducted by the divisional surgeon, a competent if unimaginative practitioner, had confirmed cardiac arrest as the immediate cause of death, but had noted, without giving it particular weight, a small and imperfectly explained bruising on the inside of the left forearm, of the kind that might result from a sharp contact with a hard edge, or alternatively from something else, something the surgeon had noted and then set aside in the absence of any other evidence of violence. There was also the question of Farr's right hand, from which the glove had been removed and was missing, not a matter that would have suggested anything particular in isolation, but in combination with the other small anomalies it was the kind of detail that nags at an attentive mind. And there was the letter in his breast pocket, or rather its absence. The breast pocket, as the surgeon had noted in his written record, appeared to have been recently accessed, the lining slightly displaced in a manner consistent with something having been removed from it rather than placed within it, and while this in itself meant nothing, a man might remove and replace correspondence many times in the course of a day. It provided a potential corroboration for Calloway's account of the letter and its subsequent disappearance. Holmes examined the written record of the medical examination with the rapid, systematic attention he gave to all documents, then set it down and asked to see what had been collected from Farr's person. The contents of the dead man's pockets were modest and unremarkable in themselves: a watch of good quality, a small amount of coin, a pocketbook containing visiting cards and a modest sum in banknotes, a keyring carrying 3 keys, and a small piece of card. Not a card of the visiting sort, but a plain card of the kind used as a price ticket or a label, on which someone had written, in a hand that was neither educated nor entirely uneducated, a sequence of letters and numbers that appeared to be neither an address nor a conventional notation of any kind. Holmes looked at this small piece of card for a considerable time. Watson, watching him, could see nothing in the sequence that suggested an obvious meaning. It was some 14 characters in length, a mixture of letters and single-digit numbers, written in pencil with the careful deliberateness of a person who is either unused to writing quickly or who is transcribing rather than composing. Holmes turned it over, held it to the window, examined the pencil marks themselves with a lens he produced from his pocket, then set it down and moved on with the apparent equanimity of a man who has received useful information even if he has not yet determined precisely what to do with it. Lestrade, who had been watching all this with the combination of professional patience and covert curiosity that characterized his dealings with Holmes, offered his own view of the card. That it was some form of commercial notation, possibly a warehouse reference or a dock ticket of the kind that would be entirely unremarkable in the hands of a man who moved between the commercial city and the riverside warehouses. Holmes did not contradict this. He said merely that it would be helpful to have the card, or a precise copy of it, and Lestrade, recognizing the implicit request, undertook to have one made. He also agreed, without apparent enthusiasm but without demurral, to share with Holmes whatever further information the police inquiry developed, a courtesy that Watson suspected reflected less generous collegiality than Lestrade's private acknowledgement that Holmes would find out what he wanted to know regardless. They left Scotland Yard into a mid-morning that had grown slightly lighter without actually becoming bright. The particular London lightness that is less an absence of cloud than a dilution of it, as though the sky has compromised between its desire for gloom and the world's demand for illumination. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes before signaling a cab, and Watson, recognizing this silence as a thinking silence rather than a preoccupied or distracted one, preserved it until Holmes emerged from it with the specific, forward-leaning quality that meant he had arrived at a preliminary conclusion or a line of inquiry he wished to pursue. Their next destination was Bermondsey. The contrast between Mincing Lane and Bermondsey was one of the great contrasts that London offered its inhabitants, a contrast not merely of prosperity and poverty, of the city's polished commercial face and the South Bank's older, rougher character, but of time itself. Mincing Lane belonged to the confident late Victorian present, to the age of steamships and telegraph and the great global networks of commodity trade that made London the commercial centre of the world. Bermondsey belonged to something older and more enduring, to the river and the tides that had governed it for centuries, to the leather tanning industry that had been its defining characteristic since the Middle Ages, to the dense, irregular streets of small houses and workshops that had grown up around the wharves without plan or regulation, producing a district of extraordinary complexity and peculiar character that the recent decades of urban improvement had touched only at its edges. Watson had been to Bermondsey before, on various occasions that had brought him to the South Bank, but he was never entirely prepared for the quality of the air there, which was distinctive to a degree that almost constituted a landscape in itself. The combination of the tannery's characteristic smell, ancient, animal, earthy, with an undertone of whatever chemicals were currently in use in the curing process. And the river smell, muddy and saline and indefinably alive, and the coal smoke that hung over everything in a yellow-grey pall, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously oppressive and oddly stimulating, the way certain strong smells are, by their very intensity, demanding of one's full attention. The street in which Farr's body had been found was barely worth the name. A narrow passage between two ancient buildings, one a warehouse of some antiquity whose timbers showed the irregular settlement of centuries, the other a structure of more recent but equally undistinguished character that appeared to serve as a storage space for the tanning trade. The passage connected two slightly larger streets and was evidently used primarily as a shortcut, its cobbles worn smooth by generations of foot traffic and still bearing the marks of the previous night's fog in patches of moisture that had not yet dried in the weak morning sun. There was nothing here, nothing visible to Watson's eye at least, that provided any immediate clue to what had happened. The police had been through the area, and whatever traces might have been left by Farr's final hours had been either removed as evidence or simply not noticed. But Holmes moved through the passage with a slow, careful attention that Watson had seen him bring to crime scenes, examining the cobbles, the walls, the iron ring set into the warehouse wall that had once served for the mooring of goods, and the single gas lamp at the entrance to the passage, which had apparently not been working on the night in question. It was at the warehouse wall that Holmes paused longest, at a point some 15 feet from the entrance to the passage, where the ancient brickwork bore a series of marks, some old, some less so, that might have been made by 100 different things over the years, but which included, at a height of approximately 4 feet from the ground, a set of relatively recent scrapes or abrasions in the soft mortar between the bricks, concentrated in a space of about 2 feet square and showing the characteristic pattern of repeated contact rather than a single impact. Holmes examined these marks with his lens, took measurements with the small telescoping measure he carried, made a series of observations in the notebook he produced for this purpose, and then straightened and looked up the wall to where a pair of iron staples, the remnants of some older fixing, protruded from the brickwork at a height of about 12 feet. Watson could not immediately see what the staples had to do with the marks on the lower wall, but he knew enough of Holmes's methods not to inquire until Holmes was ready to explain, which he would do in his own time and in the context of whatever larger pattern was beginning to emerge. The immediate neighborhood of the passage yielded one further piece of information of potential relevance. The existence, some 30 yards distant, of a small public house of the sort that in Bermondsey was called a local, a term that denoted not merely geographical proximity but a specific relationship with its community, the kind of public house that served a stable and largely predictable clientele from the surrounding streets and trades, whose landlord was consequently an excellent repository of local knowledge and observation. Holmes visited this establishment, Watson beside him, at a time when it was in that transitional state between morning closure and midday opening that gave the interior a faintly spectral quality, the chairs still inverted on the tables, the landlord himself wiping down the bar with the meditative thoroughness of a man whose work requires him to be thoughtful about surfaces. The landlord, a compact, grey-haired man in his 60s who had clearly spent most of his professional life learning to read people quickly and accurately, regarded Holmes and Watson with the specific assessment that publicans bring to strangers on their premises, an assessment that takes in social class, evident purpose, and potential trouble in a single rapid evaluation. He was cautiously helpful. Yes, there had been something going on in the passage on Sunday night. He had heard it from one of his regulars the following morning, and the regular in question, a night watchman at one of the nearby warehouses, had apparently seen a carriage in the street near the passage entrance at an unusual hour, a carriage of better quality than was customary in that area and at that time, drawn by 2 horses rather than 1, and accompanied by at least two figures whose precise appearance the night watchman had not been able to determine clearly in the darkness and fog. This information, modest as it was, gave Holmes visible satisfaction. Not because it resolved anything, but because it confirmed the direction of his preliminary hypothesis, which was that Farr had not come to Bermondsey under his own steam and had not died there accidentally. The carriage was the key element. A man who arrived in Bermondsey at midnight in a two-horse carriage of better quality had not wandered there on foot from the city, he had been brought, or had arranged to meet someone there. And a carriage of that description, in that neighborhood, at that hour, was not an anonymous presence, it was an anomaly, the kind of specific, memorable anomaly that left impressions on the minds of anyone who happened to be awake to observe it. Watson's awareness of the broader shape of Holmes's investigation sharpened considerably as the morning progressed and the individual strands began, slowly, to show the first signs of coherence. There was, as yet, no proof of anything. No evidence of foul play beyond the suggestive but inconclusive medical details, no established connection between the dead man and any criminal enterprise, no clear motive even for the hypothesis of murder that Holmes was clearly, if cautiously, entertaining. But there was a pattern of anomalies: the location, the hour, the missing letter, the missing glove, the inexplicable card, the carriage, the bruising, that collectively refused the explanation of simple misadventure and demanded something more. Holmes's genius, Watson had long understood, lay not in dramatic leaps of logic but in this, the refusal to be satisfied with the comfortable explanation, the insistence on accounting for everything including the apparently trivial, the conviction that anomalies were not noise to be filtered out but signal to be attended to. They returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon, the cab carrying them back through the labyrinthine complexity of London streets from the ancient industrial South Bank to the ordered bourgeois comfort of Marylebone, and Holmes spent the remainder of that day in a state of concentrated industry that involved the examination of several volumes from his bookshelf, a lengthy correspondence that Watson suspected, from the volume of telegrams that came and went through the afternoon, with various persons scattered across different parts of London and beyond, and a prolonged session with a large-scale map of Bermondsey and the surrounding area that he pinned to the wall of his study and marked with the precise locations of each element of the morning's information. By evening, the preliminary structure of the investigation was beginning to resolve itself, at least in Holmes's mind, into something with coherence. He had established, through the afternoon's telegraphic inquiries, that Aldous Pemberton Farr had been engaged in a dispute, characterized in the relevant commercial literature as a matter of routine commercial disagreement but which had apparently involved consideration significantly more serious than mere commercial disagreement. With a competitor in the spice and botanical trade, a man named Solomon Vetch, whose firm operated from premises in Wapping and who had been associated, at various points in the preceding decade, with transactions of a character that the commercial press had occasionally noted with mild disapproval. This connection was not new information precisely, but it took on a different coloring in light of Farr's death and the circumstances surrounding it. There was also a name that had appeared in a rather different context, in one of the notes Holmes had made during the earlier, unresolved investigation involving the government documents and the shipping company. This name was Crispin Ord, and its appearance now, in material relating to Farr's recent correspondence, was the kind of recurrence that Holmes treated with the specific attention he gave to things that refused to stay in their assigned compartments. Crispin Ord was known to Holmes as a figure of the commercial margins, not a criminal by profession, not a gentleman by standing, but something in between, a man who moved between worlds, facilitating transactions and arrangements that required a certain flexibility about the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate commerce. Such men were not uncommon in Victorian London's enormous and complex commercial landscape, where the boundaries between enterprising initiative and outright dishonesty were often contested and sometimes invisible, but they tended to accumulate connections with interesting people, and their sudden appearance in relation to a dead city merchant was not an occurrence to be dismissed. The evening brought one further development. A message from Lestrade, delivered by a constable who appeared at Baker Street in a state of some urgency, to the effect that the police had established, through the inquiries of the beat constables in Bermondsey, that the carriage observed near the passage on Sunday night had been traced, with incomplete but suggestive confidence, to a hiring establishment in Southwark, and that the hiring records of this establishment for the relevant night showed a carriage engaged in the early evening and returned in the early hours of Monday morning by a party who had paid in cash and whose description the hiring stables records preserved only in the most general terms. A man, well-dressed, of middle age, giving a name that was almost certainly false. Holmes received this news with the equanimity he maintained toward developments that confirmed his existing direction of thought, and spent the hour before dinner in a state of apparent abstraction that Watson had long since learned to respect and not interrupt. He sat beside the fire while Watson dined, Holmes himself declining to eat, as he frequently did during active investigations, claiming that the digestion competed with the brain for resources and that he preferred to maintain the balance in the brain's favor, and looked into the fire with the quality of absolute stillness that Watson had come to understand was the outward form of his most concentrated thinking. Outside, the October night had settled over Baker Street with its usual combination of darkness and gaslight and fog, the world beyond the windows reduced to a series of yellow and grey impressions, and the sounds of the street filtering up through the heavy curtains in muffled, intermittent waves. Watson had known Sherlock Holmes for long enough to understand the rhythm of his investigations, the way they moved through distinct phases that were not always obvious to an outside observer but were, to Watson's educated eye, as clearly marked as the movements of a piece of music. The current phase was one of information gathering and preliminary pattern recognition, the stage at which the individual facts lay before Holmes like pieces of an incomplete jigsaw puzzle, capable of multiple arrangements, none yet certain. The transition to the next phase, to the formation of a hypothesis firm enough to test, depended on something that Holmes could not entirely control, something that lay not in the data available to him but in the data not yet obtained. He was waiting, Watson understood, for what he often called the thread worth pulling, the single element that, when attended to with sufficient care, would draw everything else into coherence. It arrived the following morning, and from an unexpected direction. Mrs. Hudson, whose long experience with the inhabitants of 221B had given her a fairly accurate ability to distinguish between the categories of visitor who sought Holmes's attention, brought up a card at 9:30 with the information that a young woman was below and wished to speak with Mr. Holmes on a matter of some importance. The card bore the name Miss Helena Vane, and gave an address in Islington that Watson, glancing at it, placed in the upper reaches of the district's respectability. Not quite fashionable, but clearly inhabited by people who maintained standards and took some care about the impression they made on the world. Holmes examined the card briefly, then told Mrs. Hudson to send Miss Vane up. She was a woman of perhaps 28, with a quality of self-possession that suggested education and a clear practical intelligence, though she was clearly under considerable strain, which she was making an evident effort to control with only partial success. Her dress was good but not expensive, her manner composed but not easy, and she had the kind of face, fine-featured, with grey eyes that were currently shadowed with worry, that in other circumstances might have been described as quite beautiful but which at present bore the specific compression of a person who has not slept well and has been rehearsing what they are going to say for long enough to be both more and less prepared than they would wish. Holmes regarded her with the swift, systematic attention he gave to all visitors, taking in her appearance and bearing with the rapidity that Watson had long since given up trying to follow in its individual details, and then sat forward in his chair with an expression that Watson recognized as genuine interest rather than its professional simulacrum. Miss Vane's errand was this. She was employed as a private secretary and assistant to a man of business whose name was Mr. Edward Saltmarsh, and who had, she explained, with the slight deliberateness of someone who has decided exactly how much to say and is adhering carefully to that decision, been engaged for the past several months in transactions of a commercial nature that had brought him into contact with various figures in the city's commodity trade, including, within the past few weeks, a man whose death Watson immediately recognized as the occasion for the morning's early consultation. She had come to Holmes not because she had any direct knowledge of what had happened to Farr, but because she had become aware, gradually and then with accelerating concern, that her employer was frightened, and that his fear, which he was attempting to conceal from her with indifferent success, had a specific and definable character that she could only describe as the fear of someone who knows something dangerous and is uncertain what to do with that knowledge. Holmes listened to this with the absolute attentiveness that was one of his most remarkable professional qualities, the ability to give a person speaking to him the impression that they were, in that moment, the most important source of information in the world, which, from Holmes's perspective, they temporarily were. He asked, through the medium of Watson's subsequent recollection, no questions that could be construed as leading. His method with uncertain or frightened informants was always to allow them to proceed in their own direction, guided only by the occasional gentle redirection, trusting that the significant thing would emerge if sufficient space were given for it to do so. And emerge it did. In the form of a reference, almost incidental, to a particular evening some 2 weeks previously when Saltmarsh had returned to his offices in a state of visible agitation after a meeting he had described to Miss Vane only as unavoidable and unpleasant, and from his person, she had noticed because she was, by professional habit, attentive to his condition and comfort. There had been absent a small piece of card, a card with writing on it, that she had seen him handling in the days before this meeting and that had not been in evidence afterward. Watson watched Holmes receive this information with an expression of the most carefully controlled neutrality, the expression of a man who has heard something that resonates with considerable force but is determined not to reveal that resonance prematurely. Miss Vane, who was watching Holmes with the particular alertness of a person whose information is being evaluated, apparently found this neutrality reassuring rather than discouraging, for she continued, in a lower voice and with the air of someone crossing a threshold they have been approaching for some time, to add that there was one further thing, that in the papers on Saltmarsh's desk, a few days after this meeting, she had seen, briefly, before he covered it, a document of some kind that bore, at its head, a symbol or device she had not recognized and that had given her, without her being able to say precisely why, a sense of unease quite disproportionate to the simple fact of seeing an unfamiliar heading. Holmes asked, and this question Watson noted because it was the first direct question he had asked, which indicated that it was the one he most needed answered, whether she could describe this device. She could, and did. A scarlet circle, drawn or printed in red ink, within which was inscribed a simple design of 2 lines that crossed at an angle, not quite perpendicular, with a single horizontal line beneath them, a device that meant nothing to her but which had, she said, the quality of a mark or a symbol rather than a decoration, the quality of something that identified rather than merely ornamented. Holmes thanked Miss Vane with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and arranged, with the careful practicality that he brought to the management of informants, for her to communicate any further observations through Watson's address, which was both more discreet than Baker Street and potentially more convenient for a woman whose employer must not become aware of her visit. He also expressed, in a manner that Watson found both genuine and slightly surprising, a concern for her own safety, which was the clearest indication he gave, since he was careful not to specify his reasons, that whatever shape the investigation was taking in his mind, it included the possibility of a threat that extended beyond the dead man in the Bermondsey passage. When she had gone, Holmes sat for several minutes in complete silence before rising and going to a particular drawer in his desk from which he extracted a small, flat box that Watson, on the 2 or 3 occasions he had seen it before, had always taken to be a collection of personal keepsakes of the kind that even the most analytical minds occasionally preserve. The box contained, as Watson now saw, a series of slips and cuttings of the kind Holmes used for his index, but arranged with a different character than his usual reference material, more fragmentary, more explicitly speculative in character, bearing the marks of the kind of note-taking that is done when one is recording not established facts but partially formed intuitions and tentative connections. Holmes spread several of these slips on the table and looked at them with the focused attention of a man consulting a map he has made himself and knows to be provisional. Watson, looking at the slips from across the table, could read enough to gather that they contained various references, accumulated over a period of months, to a commercial organization of some kind that Holmes had been tracking intermittently. Tracking, it seemed, not as part of any specific commission but as an object of private curiosity, the way Holmes sometimes maintained a long-term interest in a phenomenon that had not yet produced a case but that his instinct told him would eventually do so. The specific character of this organization was not immediately clear from the slips, but Watson gathered that it was involved in the commodity trade in some capacity, that it had connections with certain persons whose names appeared elsewhere in Holmes's index in less complementary contexts, and that it employed, as one element of its operations, a method of communication or identification, he was not yet certain which. That involved a particular symbol, a symbol whose description Miss Vane had just provided with unwitting precision. Holmes worked in silence for the better part of an hour, redistributing and reorganizing the slips in a manner that Watson could not follow, but that clearly reflected a process of integration, of fitting Miss Vane's information and the details of Farr's death into a larger pattern that had been forming in the slips long before either element existed. Then he called for paper and wrote 3 letters, sealed them without showing Watson their contents, and sent them by the various methods he employed for communication, one by the post, one by a messenger he summoned from the street, and one by telegram to an address that Watson glimpsed briefly and recognized as being in the vicinity of Whitehall, though he could not make out the specific recipient. The afternoon that followed was, for Watson, one of those curious interludes that his accounts of Holmes's cases rarely adequately captured, the waiting periods between discoveries, the hours of apparent stillness that were in fact hours of intense invisible preparation. Holmes spent most of it at his desk, writing and consulting references, occasionally rising to pace the room in the rapid, irregular way that indicated accelerated thought rather than restlessness, twice going out briefly on errands he did not explain and returning with a particular quality of satisfaction. Mrs. Hudson was directed to prepare a better dinner than usual, which was Holmes's oblique way of indicating that the evening was likely to be demanding, and Watson, who had spent the afternoon with his medical journals in a state of companionable readiness, felt the particular anticipatory tension that always gathered in Baker Street when Holmes was approaching the active phase of an investigation. The evening brought 2 further developments that, together, advanced the inquiry to the point where action rather than observation became Holmes's primary requirement. The first was a visit from Lestrade, who arrived shortly after 7 with the combination of official gravity and personal unease that Watson had come to associate with moments when the inspector had information he recognized as significant but did not fully understand. The police had, in the course of their routine inquiries, established something about Farr's movements on the day of his death that had not appeared in the initial reports, that he had visited, in the mid-afternoon of that Sunday, a warehouse in the Bermondsey area, specifically in the Tuley Street district, a warehouse known officially as the premises of the Southwark Storage and Shipping Company, and known unofficially to Lestrade's constables, who had a working knowledge of the district's commercial geography, as a place that had, over the past 2 years or so, changed hands and purposes in a manner that had attracted some passing police interest without ever producing anything sufficiently concrete to justify formal investigation. Holmes absorbed this information with particular attention. The Southwark Storage and Shipping Company was not a name entirely unknown to him, and its appearance here, in direct connection with Farr's movements on the last day of his life, produced in him a visible quickening of interest that Watson registered with satisfaction. It was, he suspected, the thread Holmes had been waiting for, the single element that drew everything else into useful relation. The second development was a response to one of Holmes's afternoon letters, this one apparently from a contact in the city who had provided, at Holmes's request, some financial intelligence relating to Farr's firm and its recent transactions. The specific content of this intelligence Watson did not see, but its effect on Holmes was unmistakable. After reading the response, he sat entirely still for perhaps 2 minutes, then rose, put on his coat, and told Watson to do the same, for they were going out that evening, and the hour at which they would return was uncertain. This was the beginning of the active phase. London at night in October was a different city from its daytime self. Not darker merely in the literal sense, though the gaslights were unequal to the task of fully illuminating streets designed for sunlight, but darker in a more fundamental way, a city that had put away the commercial and social masks of the day and presented a different face, older and more ambiguous, to those who moved through it after dark. The street south of the river, where Holmes directed their cab, had a particular quality at night. The daytime sounds of commerce and industry replaced by a more irregular, intermittent noise, the smell of the tanneries stronger in the cold air, the passages between the warehouses deeper in shadow than any London street Holmes and Watson had previously navigated together. Watson had been on nocturnal expeditions with Holmes before, several times, and had learned that they required a particular quality of attention. A readiness to be surprised, a willingness to proceed without full information, and a trust in Holmes's judgment that was based not on blind faith but on the long experience of observing that judgment operate under pressure. Their destination, as Watson had partly anticipated, was the area around the Southwark Storage and Shipping Company. Holmes did not, however, approach the warehouse directly. Instead, they proceeded to a particular public house in the vicinity. Not the one Holmes had visited that morning, but a different establishment, one whose location relative to the warehouse suggested to Watson that Holmes had chosen it for a specific reason of geography or personnel, and settled themselves in a corner with drinks they did not particularly intend to consume, in the manner of two men spending an undemanding evening in a local public house. Holmes had adopted what Watson thought of as his neutral appearance. He had exchanged his characteristic attire for clothes that belonged to no particular class or trade, neither smart enough to attract attention nor shabby enough to invite suspicion, and had made certain minor adjustments to his bearing that Watson had often noticed but never fully been able to articulate, a slight rounding of the shoulders, a slight change in the quality of his gaze, that made him look, to the casual eye, like a man of no particular note or consequence. The public house was modestly occupied at this hour, a handful of working men in the public bar, a pair of older men engaged in a game of dominoes at a corner table, a barman of the comfortable, incurious variety who conducted his profession with the equable satisfaction of a man who has found his calling. Holmes appeared to be doing nothing more than sitting and drinking in a slightly absent manner, but Watson knew that he was in fact conducting a systematic survey of every person in the room, a survey that was complete and exact and that would, if required, produce a detailed description of every individual present, including their probable occupation, recent movements, and any aspects of their appearance or behavior that deviated from the expected. It was in this public house that Watson observed, for the first time and with startling clarity, the symbol that Miss Vane had described. It appeared on the arm of one of the men at the domino table, not tattooed, as Watson initially assumed on glimpsing it, but as a small, precise mark in what appeared to be red ink, visible at the wrist where the man's cuff had ridden up in the course of the game. It was exactly as she had described. A circle in red, containing two crossing lines and a single horizontal mark below them, the whole thing no larger than a half-crown, drawn with a neatness that suggested it was not casually made. The man bearing it was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone accustomed to physical work, wearing clothes that were decent rather than fine, and playing dominoes with the concentrated ease of a man who has played the game for many years and derives from it a genuine if modest satisfaction. Watson was careful not to look at the mark directly for more than a moment, having learned from Holmes that sustained attention of that kind can produce a corresponding awareness in the person attended to, but he had seen enough, and when he glanced at Holmes he found that Holmes had also seen it, and that the specific quality of stillness that settled over Holmes's features was the quality Watson associated with the absolute suppression of an external reaction to something internally significant. They remained in the public house for another 40 minutes, during which nothing further of immediate note occurred, and then Holmes led Watson out into the cold October night with a purposefulness that indicated he had what he had come for. They walked in silence for several minutes before Holmes spoke, and what he communicated, in the controlled, precise way he had of summarizing the current state of an investigation when he had decided that Watson needed to understand where they were, confirmed and extended what Watson had been piecing together over the preceding 2 days. The Southwark Storage and Shipping Company was, Holmes now believed, the operational center of an organization of considerable sophistication whose primary business was the management and distribution of certain classes of goods. Legitimate goods, as far as could be established from the commercial records, but goods whose precise provenance and ultimate destination were, on investigation, rather more difficult to determine than was usual in the well-regulated world of legitimate commodity trading. The organization had been in operation for perhaps 3 years, possibly more, and had maintained itself by operating at the edge of commercial respectability, by conducting its more sensitive business through intermediaries whose connection with the central operation was sufficiently indirect that direct legal liability was difficult to establish. The symbol, the scarlet circle with its interior design, served, Holmes believed, a dual function. It was, on one level, a mark of membership or affiliation, a means by which those who belonged to the organization could identify each other without the need for introduction or explanation. But it was also, on another level, a mark of something more specific, a mark that, in certain contexts, conveyed information, the way a military insignia conveys rank and affiliation without speech. What precisely it conveyed was not yet entirely clear to Holmes, but he believed it was connected to the card found in Farr's pocket, which he now thought might be not simply an identifier but part of a system of communication, a cipher, or at least a coded notation, that conveyed specific information to those who knew how to read it. The connection between this organization and Farr's death was still, Holmes acknowledged to himself. Watson could read this acknowledgement in the particular quality of care with which Holmes described what he knew as distinct from what he believed, circumstantial rather than established. But the circumstantial connections were numerous and were beginning to form a pattern that resisted innocent explanation. Farr had been in contact with someone connected to the organization, probably through the letter Calloway had described. He had visited the Southwark warehouse on the last afternoon of his life. He had been found dead in a Bermondsey passage in the early hours of Monday morning. And the letter, the thing that had presumably initiated whatever sequence of events had ended in his death, was missing. The question that Holmes had been turning over, Watson could see, was not whether Farr had been murdered. He was, Holmes had concluded, fairly certainly murdered, though the evidence remained circumstantial, but what Farr had known or discovered or possessed that had made his death, from someone's perspective, necessary. The answer to this question, Holmes believed, lay in the specific character of the organization's activities and in whatever transaction or discovery had brought Farr into contact with it. And the answer to that secondary question lay, he was increasingly certain, in the financial intelligence he had received that afternoon. In a set of transactions involving Farr's firm that, when examined with sufficient care, suggested that Farr had stumbled, perhaps inadvertently, into a position of knowledge about the organization's activities that made him dangerous to someone who needed that knowledge to remain hidden. What Watson had not yet understood, and what Holmes had not yet fully articulated even to himself, was the identity of the individual at the center of the organization, the person whose interests were served by Farr's death and who had the intelligence and the resources to arrange it as cleanly as it had been arranged. The organization was real, its activities were real, and its methods, including the hired carriage, the passage in Bermondsey, the removal of the incriminating letter, were real. But organizations do not arrange murders, individuals do, on behalf of organizations or in pursuit of their own interests. And Holmes's investigation, which had so far been concerned primarily with establishing the fact and broad context of the crime, now needed to shift its focus toward the narrower and more dangerous question of the criminal. It was in pursuit of this question that the investigation entered its most complex and, in Watson's memory, most intellectually demanding phase. The phase in which the visible trail gave way to the invisible one, the phase in which Holmes's method had to operate not on physical clues and commercial records but on inference and projection and the kind of reasoning that proceeded not from what was present but from what was absent, not from what had happened but from what, given everything else, must have been the case. The following morning Holmes was up before Watson arrived, which was early, and had already been out. The quality of his coat and boots indicated that he had been walking in the fog, possibly for some time, which was a practice he sometimes engaged in when a problem required the kind of unfocused, ambulatory thinking that the streets of London, with their infinite variety of stimulus, particularly encouraged. He had, on his return, received 2 further communications. One a response to the Whitehall telegram he had sent the previous day, and one a note that had apparently been delivered by hand, whose paper and envelope Watson glanced at with the automatic observation of a man who has spent long years in Holmes's company and has learned to read documents as well as people. The paper was of good quality, the writing on the envelope firm and assured, and the absence of any stamp or postmark confirmed that it had been delivered in person. Holmes read Watson the relevant portions of both communications with the careful selection of a man who is managing how much information to release and when, a management that was never, in Watson's experience, motivated by anything other than the investigation's requirements. Holmes shared information with Watson when sharing it would help, and withheld it when withholding it would do no harm and premature disclosure might do damage. The Whitehall response confirmed certain aspects of Holmes's hypothesis about the organization's activities in terms that were suggestive without being definitive. The hand-delivered note, whose origin Holmes did not immediately explain, contained information about a specific shipment that had passed through the Southwark warehouse some 6 weeks previously, a shipment whose nature was not entirely clear from the note but whose value, a figure was mentioned, was considerable by any standard. This shipment was, Holmes now believed, the specific nexus of the investigation, the thing around which everything else had arranged itself. He did not yet know precisely what the shipment had contained, though he had a hypothesis. He did not yet know precisely how far had come to know about it, though he had a theory. But he knew, or believed, with the quality of confidence that in Holmes was the functional equivalent of knowledge. That it was at the center of the matter, and that when he understood it fully he would understand everything else. The day's work proceeded through a series of inquiries and visits that Watson experienced partly in Holmes's company and partly when Holmes wished to conduct certain investigations alone, as he occasionally did for reasons of either discretion or the need for a specific approach that Watson's company would hinder. In his own, following lines that Holmes specified with the precision of a general directing separate columns toward the same objective. Watson's assignment for the late morning was the company's registry in Somerset House, where he spent 2 hours examining the registered details of the Southwark Storage and Shipping Company and such related companies as appeared in the documents he was directed to. Documents that turned out to contain, buried in the layers of corporate structure that late Victorian commercial law both permitted and encouraged, a set of directorial connections of considerable interest. The company had several directors, most of them names with no particular resonance, but one of them, appearing not in the current registration but in a previous registration, 3 years old, from which this director had apparently resigned, was a name that Watson recognized instantly from Holmes's earlier briefing, Crispin Ord. Watson recorded this and returned to Baker Street to find Holmes engaged in a task that struck him, initially, as incongruous. He was, apparently, translating. He sat at his desk with the card from Farr's pocket, or rather a carefully made copy of it, for Lestrade still held the original, and a sheet of paper covered with attempts, their marks of revision visible, to render the sequence of characters into something coherent. Watson recognized, from his knowledge of Holmes's capabilities, that this was not the simple application of a known cipher technique. If it were, Holmes would have solved it already, for he had a command of cryptographic systems that was essentially comprehensive. The difficulty lay in the fact that the system used was not a standard one, which meant that the solution required not merely the application of known technique but the construction of the technique itself, working backward from the ciphertext toward an unknown key. Holmes had been working on this problem intermittently since the previous morning, in the spaces between other aspects of the investigation, and he was now, Watson sensed, close to a solution, with the specific quality of concentrated closure that he brought to intellectual problems in their final stages. The approach he was taking, Watson could follow this much from the papers on the desk, was based on a preliminary hypothesis about the nature of the system. That it was not a letter substitution cipher of the classical type but something more contextual, a code in which each character or group of characters referred not to a letter or sound but to a thing, a name, or a location, with a key existing not in an algorithm but in a specific document or reference that both parties to the communication possessed. This kind of code was in some ways harder to crack than a cipher because its meaning was not recoverable from the text alone. However cleverly manipulated, it required knowing, or being able to deduce, what the reference document was. Holmes's hypothesis about the reference document was itself a deduction from everything else he knew about the investigation, a deduction that Watson, when Holmes eventually explained it, recognized as elegant in its economy. The card in Farr's pocket, Holmes reasoned, had not been placed there by the dead man but had been left there intentionally, by whoever had engineered his death, as a communication to another party who was expected to find the body before the police did. This party, for whom the card was intended, would have known the reference document and been able to read it. The police had found the body first, the card had passed into their custody, and the communication had consequently failed to reach its intended recipient. What the card said, Holmes believed, was an instruction, a location, a time, a set of instructions for action, and the reference document was almost certainly something that both the sender and intended recipient of the card would have had routine access to. A commercial catalogue, a trade directory, a published price list of the kind circulated among firms in the commodity trade. This hypothesis, applied to the specific sequence on the card and tested against several candidate publications from Holmes's reference collection, produced, on the fourth candidate, which was a quarterly published price list for Eastern botanical imports, a document that both Farr's firm and the Southwark Company would routinely have possessed, a coherent result. The characters on the card, decoded by reference to this publication, yielded not a sentence in ordinary language but a series of references, a warehouse number, a date that was 4 days hence, a quantity, and what appeared to be an abbreviated name. The name was not fully decipherable, being reduced to 3 letters, but those 3 letters, given everything else Holmes now knew, were sufficient to produce in him a quality of certainty that Watson had seen before, and that meant the central question of the investigation had been answered. The name, or rather its 3-character abbreviation, pointed toward a specific individual in the organization, not Ord, who was a facilitator rather than a principal, but someone considerably higher, someone whose public identity was entirely respectable and whose connection to the Southwark operation had been maintained through layers of legal and commercial insulation that had, until now, prevented it from surfacing in any official record. This individual was, Holmes now believed, the person who had arranged Farr's death. Not personally but through the machinery of the organization, because Farr had somehow come into possession of information, probably through the financial transactions of the preceding months, that would have exposed this connection and destroyed a reputation that was genuinely considerable and worth protecting at a very high cost. Watson, receiving this synthesis, felt the familiar combination of intellectual satisfaction and practical apprehension that characterized the final phases of Holmes's investigations. Intellectual satisfaction because the logic was complete and the shape of the crime was now, in its essentials, clear. A man had discovered something he should not have discovered, had probably made the fatal mistake of attempting to use that knowledge. Perhaps for commercial advantage, perhaps simply to resolve an awkward situation, but in either case in a way that precipitated his death. The organization had responded with the calculated efficiency that Holmes had observed in its other operations, arranging a death that looked like natural misadventure and leaving almost no trace, almost but not quite. The apprehension was the recognition that knowing something and proving it are different conditions, and that the evidence assembled so far, however logically persuasive, was insufficient for any legal proceeding. Holmes needed more, and getting more meant, almost certainly, entering the territory of the organization in a more direct and therefore more dangerous way than the investigation had so far required. The date recovered from the card was 4 days away. This was the first concrete time-bound element the investigation had produced, and it gave the inquiry a new urgency that had not previously been present. Something was going to happen at the Southwark warehouse on that date, some transaction or transfer or meeting, and Holmes intended to be in a position to observe it. More than observe it, if circumstances permitted. To produce, from its observation, the kind of direct and irrefutable evidence that would move the matter from the realm of inference to the realm of proof. Lestrade was summoned and briefed, with the particular care Holmes took in briefings of this kind, providing enough to engage the inspector's official authority and resources without providing enough to allow him to proceed without Holmes, which would have been premature and likely disastrous given the sensitivity of the matter. Lestrade received the briefing with his usual combination of skepticism, recognition of Holmes's track record, and the cautious procedural conservatism of a professional lawman who is aware that the rules of evidence are more demanding than the rules of inference. He agreed to make certain discreet inquiries of his own and to have resources available for the night in question, while making clear that he would require considerably more before committing to any formal action. This was, Holmes acknowledged to Watson afterward, entirely reasonable given Lestrade's position, and he had not expected anything different. The 4 days that followed were, for Watson, days of particular atmospheric intensity. The combination of the knowledge that something definitive was approaching, the continued uncertainty about its precise form, and the quality of contained urgency that these conditions produced in Holmes, who worked with a focus and energy that Watson associated with his best states of engagement. The states in which all his remarkable capacities were fully committed to a single purpose, and the result was a quality of intellectual operation that, even after years of observation, Watson found genuinely extraordinary. During these 4 days, Holmes completed his picture of the organization and its activities. The shipment that had passed through the Southwark warehouse 6 weeks previously, and whose nature had been suggested rather than specified in the hand-delivered note, was now clearer. It was a consignment of goods of considerable commercial value that had been represented in official documents as one thing and had in fact been another. not, as Watson might initially have assumed, an entirely illegal commodity, but a legitimate one whose documentation had been falsified in ways that avoided certain customs duties and violated certain trade agreements, the specific nature of which Holmes had established through the combination of his Whitehall contact and his own analysis of the shipping records he had managed to obtain. The monetary advantage thus obtained was significant but not enormous in absolute terms. What made it significant in context was the pattern of similar transactions over a period of 2 years that, taken together, represented a very considerable sum and implicated, in Watson's mind, not merely the Southwark operation but a wider network of commercial complicity. Farr had discovered this pattern, or at least a part of it, in the course of examining the financial accounts of a proposed commercial arrangement with the Southwark Company, an arrangement whose terms had brought him, in the ordinary course of commercial due diligence, into contact with documents that he should not have seen. His response to what he found had not, Holmes thought, been immediately criminal, had not, that is, been an attempt at blackmail or financial exploitation in any crude sense. Rather, Farr had done what a man of his commercial training and instinct would naturally do. He had sought to understand what he had found before deciding what to do with it, and this process of understanding had led him, step by step, closer to the center of the operation and closer to the identity of the person at its head, until he reached a point where he knew too much for the organization's comfort and where the letter Calloway had described, the letter that had been removed from Farr's pocket, had been sent to him, offering a resolution of some kind, almost certainly a financial resolution of the type that amounts to a purchase of silence. What Farr had said or done in response to this letter was not known. What was known was that he had, on the Sunday of his death, gone to the Southwark warehouse in the afternoon and then to the passage in Bermondsey in the evening, and that at some point during these movements he had died of what the death certificate would record as cardiac arrest, but what Holmes was now effectively certain had been induced by means that the divisional surgeon, not looking for them, had not identified. The specific means remained unclear, and this was the one element of the case that, from a purely evidential standpoint, concerned Holmes most acutely. Without the means established, the attribution of the death to human agency rather than natural causes was difficult to make formally. It was this concern that led Holmes, on the second of the 4 days, to have a conversation with a particular physician of his acquaintance whose specialization in certain branches of toxicology had been of use in previous investigations. This conversation, conducted privately, without Watson's presence, at the physician's rooms in Harley Street, apparently satisfied Holmes on the crucial point, for he returned from it with a quiet precision about the likely mechanism of death and a determination to arrange, through Lestrade, a more thorough post-mortem examination by a specialist, an examination that was duly conducted and that, while it could not establish the specific agent beyond all reasonable doubt at this late stage, produced sufficient evidence to rule out the natural cardiac explanation with the degree of confidence that a legal proceeding would require. Watson spent part of these 4 days pursuing lines of inquiry of his own, specifically, at Holmes's direction, an examination of the social connections of the individual whose abbreviated name had emerged from the decoded card. This individual. Watson was now in possession of the full name, which he would not commit to his contemporary notes for reasons of caution but which he preserved in his memory with the particular clarity that attended information of this kind, was a figure of genuine standing in London's commercial and social world. He sat on the boards of several legitimate companies, was a member of clubs whose membership lists included men of the highest respectability, had served on committees and commissions of a public character, and maintained a domestic life of the kind that Victorian London considered the visible guarantee of moral standing, a house in Belgravia, a family, a routine of church attendance and charitable activity that presented all the markers of a man at ease with his own rectitude. This surface, Watson could not avoid this word, was so complete and so carefully maintained that it had evidently deflected all previous inquiry, and the idea that beneath it lay the directing intelligence of an operation that had culminated in a man's death would, to anyone not in possession of Holmes's evidence, have appeared the product of a disordered imagination. Holmes's preparation for the night of the warehouse visit was thorough and methodical in a way that reflected his assessment of the risk involved. The organization, he believed, was capable of violence. Farr's death had demonstrated that, and the person at its center was capable, under sufficient pressure, of authorizing it. This was not a situation in which overconfidence or casual improvisation was appropriate. Holmes made careful practical arrangements. He ensured that Lestrade had agreed to have a police presence within a specified distance, to be deployed on a signal that Holmes would arrange to transmit. He reconnoitred the area around the warehouse on each of the preceding evenings, under cover of various identities and pretexts that enabled him to understand its layout, its approach roads, its exits, and its supervision. And he arranged for Watson to be present but at a specific remove from the central action, positioned where he could observe and, if necessary, act as a messenger or second option, but not so close as to increase the exposure unnecessarily. Watson received these arrangements with the combination of professional acceptance and private concern that he had long since learned was the appropriate response to Holmes's operational planning. He had been in dangerous situations with Holmes before, and he understood better than most the quality of calculated risk that Holmes brought to such situations, the careful calibration of exposure against intelligence, the disciplined evaluation of what was necessary and what was merely dramatic. But there was always, in Watson's honest acknowledgement, a residual uncertainty, a recognition that the most careful plan operated on the assumption of other people's behavior conforming to one's predictions, and that people, including dangerous and frightened ones, were not always predictable. He said nothing of this, because there was nothing useful to say, and instead spent the afternoon of the fourth day reviewing the case in its entirety, reading his own notes with the critical attention of a man who is going to need to provide an account of events he cannot yet fully foresee. The night itself arrived, as such nights always do, with an indifference to the significance one has attributed to them. The October fog had thickened over the preceding days, as October fogs in London were apt to do when the temperature dropped and the wind fell, and by 9 in the evening the streets south of the river were navigable only by those who knew them well. The gas lamps reduced to smears of orange light in the general murk, and the sounds of the wharves and warehouses muffled to a spectral quietness that seemed wholly inconsistent with the volume of commerce they represented in the daylight hours. Holmes and Watson approached the Southwark warehouse complex by a route that Holmes had planned. A route that avoided the main approach roads, moved through a set of back courts and passages that Holmes's reconnoitering had established as unmonitored, and brought them to a position on the south side of the warehouse building, approximately 30 yards from the main entrance, where a cluster of old storage bins and a parked dray provided enough cover for observation without requiring any penetration of the building itself. Watson's position was here, with the arrangement that he would maintain observation and be ready to send the signal to Lestrade at Holmes's direction, while Holmes himself moved to a closer position, one that would enable him to observe the interior of the warehouse through a ground-level window whose shutter, he had established on a previous visit, was improperly secured. They took their positions at 10:30, and the wait that followed was of that particular quality that Watson had experienced enough times in Holmes's company to have developed a specific orientation toward, a patience that was not passive but alert, a stillness that was not absence of attention but its most concentrated form. The sounds of the river came to them faintly through the fog, the slap of water, the creak of timber, the occasional sound of a vessel moving in the dark. And the smell of the place, the combination of salt and mud and industry and old rope that was the specific atmosphere of London's working riverfront, surrounded them completely. Watson was cold in the way that one becomes cold waiting in a damp October night, a cold that enters by degrees and settles into the joints and chest with the patient inexorability of rising water. At approximately 11 o'clock, things began to happen. The first indication was sound rather than sight. The sound of wheels on cobbles, approaching from the east, and then the particular quality of sound that accompanies a vehicle being drawn up and stopped, the creak of harness, the shifting of hooves. Then a different sound, the sound of human movement, the quiet purposeful sounds of people who are attempting to be quiet, which have a specific quality distinct from natural silence. A self-consciousness, a deliberateness, that is paradoxically more audible than simply proceeding without concern. Light appeared at the main entrance of the warehouse, not the stable light of the gas lamps that served the area but the more mobile, directed light of lanterns carried by people who were moving. Watson, from his position, could see enough of the warehouse entrance to observe 2 figures enter, followed after a short interval by 2 more, and then by the sound of something heavy being moved inside, something on wheels that protested against the stone floor of the warehouse with a grinding, intermittent complaint. He could not see Holmes from his position, and was not supposed to try, but he was aware of his absence in the way that one is always aware, in such situations, of the person who has moved into the zone of highest risk. What Watson observed over the next 40 minutes was the outer form of a transaction, the arrival, in stages, of several individuals at the warehouse. The movement of goods that were evidently being transferred from one vehicle to another, or from storage to vehicle, though the precise mechanics of this were invisible from Watson's position, a series of intervals of waiting alternating with bursts of purposeful movement. And, at approximately 11:15, the arrival of a fourth vehicle, which drew up at the warehouse entrance with a precision that suggested the driver knew exactly where he was going and had been there before, and from which descended a single figure whose clothing and bearing, even at this distance and in this light, communicated the quality of authority, the particular quality of a person accustomed to arriving at places and having those places adjust to their arrival. Watson did not see Holmes's signal. He heard it, a sound that was not quite an owl and not quite a whistle, repeated twice, which they had agreed was the signal for Lestrade to bring his people forward. The sound came from somewhere close to the warehouse wall, from the position Holmes had taken, and Watson's response was immediate and automatic. He moved to the pre-arranged communication point at the edge of the nearest court and delivered the relay signal. A lantern flash, 3 quick, 1 long, that Lestrade's people were waiting for 2 streets away. What happened in the warehouse during the next 20 minutes Watson did not directly witness, being occupied with the relay and subsequently with remaining in position as Holmes had directed. But Holmes described it to him afterward, in the particular retrospective style he used when reconstructing events for Watson's later record. A style that was accurate and complete without being dramatic, conveying the facts of what had occurred with the precision of a scientific account and leaving the emotional content, as always, to Watson's interpretive contribution. Holmes had been in a position, through the improperly secured shutter, to observe the interior of the warehouse clearly enough for his purposes. The transaction being conducted there was exactly what the decoded card had suggested. A transfer of goods, specifically of a consignment that bore the documentation of one commodity but contained another, substantially more valuable. One, the consignment that was in its present state simultaneously evidence of commercial fraud, evidence of customs violation, and evidence of a pattern of business that would, when its full extent was established, constitute one of the more significant financial crimes investigated in the preceding decade. Holmes had observed sufficient of this transaction to understand it in its essentials, and had identified, with certainty, the person at its center, the person whose abbreviated name had appeared on the card, whose connection to the Southwark operation had been maintained through such careful insulation, and whose presence at the warehouse on this night confirmed what Holmes had deduced. He had also. This was the element that Watson found most admirable and most characteristic of Holmes's operational approach, made provision for what he observed to be independently verifiable. He had brought with him certain equipment, including a small but effective camera of the type then becoming available, which he had used to record, through the warehouse window, images of sufficient clarity that the identities of the parties present and the nature of the goods being transferred were documented in a form that could not subsequently be explained away or denied. This was evidence, not inference. The kind of evidence that Lestrade, when he arrived with his constables, could act upon immediately and that the courts could subsequently act upon with the appropriate results. Lestrade's people arrived in the warehouse approximately 18 minutes after Watson's signal, which was fast given the conditions, and what they found when they arrived completed the evidentiary picture in ways that Holmes had anticipated but could not have absolutely guaranteed. The goods, the documentation, the parties, and, crucially, a set of communications found on the central figure's person that, when combined with what Holmes had accumulated over the preceding week, produced a case of exceptional clarity and completeness. The principal individual was taken into custody with the quiet efficiency that characterizes official action when it has been well prepared, and the several others present were retained for questioning, from which additional material evidence emerged in the hours that followed. Holmes left the warehouse before the official proceedings were complete, as was his habit. Having no particular interest in the procedural aspects of legal process once the investigative work was done, and finding, he had always said, the closing stages of a case less satisfying than its opening ones, which contained the challenge and the intellectual interest, while the closing stages contained primarily the confirmation of what he had already determined. Watson joined him in the street outside, and they walked together in the cold fog toward the bridge, the sounds of official activity dying behind them, and Watson found, as he often did at such moments, that Holmes's apparent detachment from the human drama of what had just occurred was not indifference to the human stakes but something more complex. A kind of professional discipline, a maintenance of the intellectual frame that was the condition of his effectiveness, and which could not be abandoned without cost even in moments when the emotional claims of the situation were perfectly clear. The subsequent unfolding of the legal case was, as such things tend to be, protracted and not always straightforward, involving the kind of procedural complexities that the Victorian legal system imposed upon all significant criminal matters and that are, in Watson's experience, more interesting to legal professionals than to the lay observer. The principal figure, whose name Watson had determined not to publish in any account intended for general circulation during the period when legal proceedings were ongoing, was committed for trial on charges that included fraud, conspiracy, and an accessory charge relating to Farr's death, the last of these being the most difficult to sustain with complete certainty, but supported by the cumulative weight of evidence that Holmes had assembled with such systematic care. The evidence of Farr's murder, specifically, rested on the combination of the specialist post-mortem evidence, the decoded card and its implications for the pre-planned character of the meeting in Bermondsey, the hired carriage, the missing letter, and the evidence of the organization's methods recovered from the papers found at the warehouse, papers that, among other things, contained a reference to Farr's situation that was sufficiently unambiguous to support the inference of premeditation. None of these elements, taken alone, would have been conclusive. Together, with Holmes's interpretive work connecting them, they constituted a case of that imperfect but sufficient character that is the realistic best outcome of most criminal investigations where the principals have taken care to avoid obvious evidence. The trial, when it eventually came, was conducted with the solemnity appropriate to its object and its implications. Watson attended some days of it, not as a participant but as an observer, and recorded his impressions in notes that were at once clinical and deeply engaged, the dual quality that long experience with Holmes had given him, the ability to see both the specific human detail and the larger pattern. The defendant maintained, through the early stages of the proceedings, the kind of rigid composure that Watson associated with a certain type of well-bred English stoicism. The conviction, or its performance, that one's dignity was not to be sacrificed to circumstances however adverse. This composure, as the evidence accumulated, became more difficult to sustain, and there were moments in the proceedings when Watson, watching from the gallery, could observe the precise cost of maintaining it. The quality of sustained effort, the micro-expressions of a man who is holding a mask in place against mounting pressure, that were invisible to most in the room but entirely legible to Watson's trained and experienced eye. Holmes himself attended only one day of the trial, the day on which his own evidence was heard. He gave it with the calm, precise efficiency he brought to all such formal occasions, neither elaborating beyond what the question required nor conceding what the opposing advocate's questions attempted to extract from him, a performance that Watson, watching, thought represented one of the purest demonstrations of Holmes's intelligence in action. The ability to maintain absolute accuracy while giving nothing that was not already established, navigating the adversarial form of legal examination with the same quality of systematic, purposeful attention he brought to everything. The verdict, when it came, was what the evidence required. The sentence, imposed with the gravity appropriate to the offences and their consequences, concluded the formal legal aspect of the matter and produced, in those who had been closely involved in it, Watson, Holmes, Lestrade, and the various other persons whose lives and concerns had intersected with the investigation, different forms of the satisfaction that accompanies the resolution of something that had demanded their sustained best effort. Watson, reflecting on the case in the weeks after the trial, was struck by several aspects of it that seemed to him characteristic of Holmes's finest work. The first was the quality of patience. The willingness to proceed without the comfort of certainty, to hold multiple hypotheses in productive tension until the evidence required a commitment, and to treat the investigation as a process of progressive clarification rather than a search for confirmation of a predetermined conclusion. Watson had seen investigators, official and unofficial, who brought to their work the intellectual vice of premature certainty, who formed their hypothesis early and then treated all subsequent evidence as confirmation of it, filtering out what didn't fit and distorting what was ambiguous. Holmes did precisely the opposite, and the result was a quality of conclusion that was, in its own fashion, beautiful. The second was the multiplication of sources and angles of approach. The case had been solved not by a single brilliant stroke of deduction but by the systematic combination of many small elements. The commercial records, the medical evidence, the decoded card, the warehouse observations, the testimony of Miss Vane, the reconnoitered geography of the crime, the identification of the symbol, each of which contributed something to the picture and none of which, taken alone, would have been sufficient. This multiplication was characteristic of Holmes at his best, and its product was a case whose evidentiary foundation was so broad and so carefully constructed that it resisted the efforts of the defense to undermine it. The third, and in some ways the most important, was the sustained attention to what was not there, to the missing letter, the missing glove, the missing entry in the commercial records, the missing explanation for Farr's presence in Bermondsey. Holmes had a particular genius for the absence, for the trace left by the removal of something that should have been present, and it was this sensitivity to negative evidence that had, at several points in the investigation, provided the most important directional signals. The missing letter was the first such signal, the decoded card was the second, the gap in the organization's directorial records, where Ord's name appeared only in historical documentation, was the third. Each of these absences had pointed somewhere, and following them had been as important as following the presences. The days after the trial returned Holmes and Watson to the familiar rhythms of Baker Street, the particular combination of availability and readiness that characterized Holmes's between-case periods. The violin, the chemical experiments, the indexing and re-indexing of accumulated material, the reading that was always prodigious and sometimes apparently random, the tobacco and the silence, and then the sudden galvanic resumption of activity when something new appeared. Watson, resuming his practice and his domestic routine, found himself returning in his thoughts to the investigation with a frequency that surprised him. Not to its dramatic moments, of which there had been fewer than in some of Holmes's cases, but to its quieter ones, the ones that had seemed, at the time, less significant than they turned out to be. He thought particularly of Miss Vane, whose courage in coming to Baker Street had been the investigation's turning point, and who had displayed throughout the case a quality of practical intelligence and moral seriousness that Watson found deeply admirable. He thought of Calloway and the specific texture of his unease at that first interview, the quality of a man who knows more than he says, who is afraid of something specific, and who is making careful calculations about the cost and benefit of different degrees of candor. He thought of the public house in Bermondsey, and the man at the domino table, and the small red circle on his wrist, which had been, in retrospect, the moment the investigation crystallized from collection of facts into formed hypothesis. And he thought, as he always did at the conclusion of Holmes's cases, about the people who had not been in the Baker Street rooms, who had not presented themselves as clients or witnesses, who had simply been caught in the particular configuration of circumstances that had produced a crime and its resolution, F.A. R.R. himself, dead in a Bermondsey passage, whatever combination of commercial acuity and bad judgment had brought him to that end, the men in the warehouse, most of them engaged in a relatively minor way in an operation whose full character they probably did not know. And the person at the center of it, now facing the legal consequences of decisions that had begun, as such decisions usually do, in the small corruptions of commercial life and had escalated, in the specific way that escalations of this kind follow a logic of their own, to the ultimate corruption. Holmes, for his part, had moved on in the characteristic way. Not indifferently, but with the professional discipline of a man who understands that dwelling on completed cases impedes readiness for the next one, and that the next one, in London, was always coming. He had filed the case in his index with the precision and completeness he brought to all such filings, adding it to the accumulation of material that formed his unique personal encyclopedia of crime and its investigation. He had corresponded briefly with Lestrade, who had been, in the generous acknowledgement that the inspector occasionally and somewhat reluctantly extended, entirely correct in his original assessment of the matter. He had sent a brief note to Miss Vane, containing nothing that was not entirely professional in its character but conveying, Watson thought, a genuine recognition of her courage and intelligence that was not merely formulaic. And he had returned to his violin and his chemistry and his reading and his waiting, the posture of permanent preparedness that Watson had always thought of as Holmes's fundamental state of being, not a period between cases but the condition from which all cases were approached, the essential Holmes, alert and ready and quietly confident that London, the inexhaustible city, would provide. Watson, for his part, was content to wait with him. The fog still lay over Baker Street. It would lie over London for weeks yet, lifting briefly and returning with the persistence of a season that has no intention of relinquishing its hold. And the gas lamps still cast their uncertain light over the familiar outlines of the buildings and the movements of the people and vehicles below, and the city went on about its enormous, complicated, indifferent business in the way it always had and the way it would, Watson was certain, continue to do long after both he and Holmes had made their final entries in the extraordinary ledger they had been keeping together for so many years. There was, however, one further development in the case of the Scarlet merchant that Watson had not anticipated and that Holmes, it became apparent, had expected but had chosen not to mention, the reappearance of a name that had been present from the beginning of the inquiry but had never quite come into focus, remaining at the edge of the investigation like a figure seen at the periphery of vision that disappears when one looks directly at it. The name was Crispin Ord, who had not been among those arrested at the warehouse and who had not, as far as the official investigation was concerned, been definitively connected to the central transaction in a way that justified formal charges. Ord was, as Holmes had described him, a man of the commercial margins. Too careful and too well informed about the practical limits of legal exposure to have been present on the night in question, too intelligent to have left his name in any document of obvious incrimination, and too useful to too many people to have been an easy target for the kind of commercial pressure that might have induced cooperation with the authorities. But Ord, it turned out, had not been idle during the period of the trial. What Holmes learned, through the network of professional and semi-professional informants he maintained across the various districts and trades of London, was that Ord had been conducting, in the weeks since the warehouse incident, a careful process of disconnection. Of severing the threads that connected him to the Southwark operation and to its principal, of arranging his affairs in ways that reflected a man who expected circumstances to change materially in the near future and was preparing accordingly. This preparation was itself interesting, but what was more interesting, and what brought it to Holmes's attention in the specific form that required him to act, was a particular piece of information about a new connection that Ord was in the process of establishing, a connection with a commercial operation in a different part of London whose character, when Holmes investigated it with the same systematic thoroughness he had brought to the Southwark case, proved to have certain structural similarities to the Southwark operation that could not be accidental. Holmes had recognized, long before the conclusion of the Scarlet merchant investigation, that the organization he had disrupted was not the creation of a single individual operating in isolation, but was embedded in a larger pattern of commercial deception that existed across multiple firms and districts and that had been developing, through the specific form of incremental corruption that Victorian London's commercial world was not immune to, over a period of considerably more than the 2 or 3 years that the Southwark Company's records covered. The individual at the center of the warehouse operation was, in Holmes's judgment, a significant but not sole element of something larger, something that the legal proceedings against him would damage but not destroy, because its other elements remained in place and would continue to operate through different channels and different men. Ord was one of those elements. Not the most important, but important enough to matter, and important enough, given the specific character of the new connection he was in the process of establishing, to require attention before that connection became operational and the pattern repeated itself in a new configuration. This recognition, and the direction of inquiry it produced, was not a new case but the continuation of the old one. The recognition that the investigation of the Scarlet merchant had been not the end of a story but the illumination of a larger one, the visible portion of something whose full extent remained unknown. Holmes's response to this recognition was characteristic. Not alarm, not a sense of having been misled by his earlier conclusion, but a quiet and methodical adjustment of his attention toward the next necessary point of inquiry, an adjustment that was so smooth and so continuous that Watson, reflecting on it, could not have said precisely when one investigation ended and another began, because in Holmes's mind, as Watson had gradually come to understand, they never quite did. The cases succeeded each other not as separate chapters but as connected passages in a larger account, each one illuminating aspects of its predecessors and suggesting the shape of those that followed, and the London that Holmes inhabited and investigated was not a series of separate problems but a single enormous, interconnected, endlessly complex system that rewarded nothing so much as the sustained, patient, systematic attention that Holmes, alone among those who studied it, was equipped to give. Watson returned to Baker Street one afternoon in November, 3 weeks after the trial's conclusion, and found Holmes at his desk with the same quality of concentrated industry that he had observed on that October morning when the fire notice had first appeared in the Times, and for a moment, before Holmes looked up and produced the expression of controlled excitement that Watson had learned to associate with the opening of something new. He felt the particular pleasure of repetition, of the recurrence of a pattern that had proven its value, the recognition that the rhythm of Baker Street was not monotony but something better, the reliable return of a way of working that worked, in the hands of a man who had devoted his extraordinary intelligence and his singular discipline to making it work as well as it possibly could. Outside, the November fog was thicker than October's had been, the city more completely enclosed within its grey self-containment, and the gas lamps had come on early, their pale light a promise rather than a solution, a gesture toward illumination in the general murk. Inside, the fire was bright, the coffee was fresh, and Holmes was already talking. The threads that Aud's new activities had provided led Holmes, in the subsequent weeks, through a landscape of Victorian London that was, in some respects, even more opaque than the Southwark riverfront that had been the scene of the preceding investigation. The commercial world of the city, in its legitimate manifestation, was a thing of considerable transparency. Its records were public, its principles were identifiable, its transactions left traces in the documents that governed Victorian commercial life. But the margins of that world, the zones in which legitimate and illegitimate commerce blurred and merged, were governed by quite different principles, principles of concealment, indirection, and the cultivation of appearances that bore only the most convenient relationship to underlying realities. Aud operated in these margins with the professionalism of a man who has spent his working life there and who has learned to move through them with a minimum of traceable disturbance. His new connection was with a firm that, on the surface, engaged in perfectly ordinary trading activity. The import and distribution of certain categories of Eastern goods, specifically the kind of high-value botanical products in which Farr's firm had also specialized, and whose legitimate trade was conducted through the established channels of Mincing Lane and the commodity exchanges. Below this surface, however, and it was characteristic of the work that the surface was always present and always maintained with care, that the anomalies existed not in the visible structure but in the spaces between its elements, was a pattern of secondary activity whose specific character Holmes was in the process of establishing. Watson's role in this new investigation was, initially, less active than in the Scarlet merchant case. Holmes was moving more cautiously here, more aware of the risks involved in alerting an organization that had seen one of its principal operations disrupted and that would consequently be on a heightened state of alertness. But Watson's contribution, when it came, proved to be one of those fortunate coincidences that the investigation of crime in a city as large and as socially complex as London occasionally produced. His medical practice brought him, entirely without design on his part, into contact with a patient whose professional circumstances placed him in proximity to the new operation and who, over the course of several consultations for a complaint of entirely ordinary character, let fall observations that were, to Watson's educated ear, sufficiently suggestive to justify a careful report to Holmes. Holmes received this report with the specific quality of attention that Watson had come to associate with moments when the investigation of a case suddenly opened in an unexpected direction. A quality not of surprise, exactly, since Holmes rarely appeared genuinely surprised by anything, but of a rapid and visible adjustment of his existing model to accommodate the new information, a process that resembled, in Watson's imagination, the adjustment of a complex mechanical system when a new component is introduced. A series of small, rapid recalibrations, each one following necessarily from the last, producing at the end a configuration that was subtly but significantly different from what had preceded it. The patient, Watson never disclosed identifying details of his patients even in private notes, and maintained this discipline here with particular care. Had mentioned, in the context of a conversation about his professional situation that was only marginally related to the medical matter at hand, a particular arrangement involving the storage and movement of goods that bore a resemblance, in its structural description, to what Holmes had observed at the Southwark warehouse. The resemblance was not exact, the new arrangement was differently organized, differently documented, and operated through different commercial vehicles. but the underlying principle was the same, and the name that appeared at its center, when Watson had gently and professionally explored the topic with the patient, was one that Holmes had not previously encountered, but that, when he applied his knowledge of the commercial world and its connections, proved to have threads running back toward familiar territory. The investigation that followed was slower, more methodical, and in some ways more technically demanding than the Scarlet merchant case, demanding, specifically, of the kind of patient, unglamorous work that Holmes brought to its resolution with the same quality of systematic thoroughness as to the more dramatic aspects of his practice, but which found less natural expression in Watson's later narrative accounts because it offered fewer of the surface features. The decisive scene, the confrontation, the moment of revelation, that narrative naturally gravitates toward. It involved the detailed examination of commercial records, the patient cultivation of informants, the careful mapping of connections between apparently unrelated entities, and the gradual construction of a picture that was, by the end of it, both broader and more complex than the Scarlet merchant case had been. The broader picture, as it emerged from this second investigation and from the connections it revealed between the Southwark operation and its successor, was one that Holmes communicated to Watson in several conversations spread over the weeks of November and December, conversations that Watson found both illuminating and, in a specific way, disturbing. Disturbing not because the picture was unexpected but because it was, in its essential character, entirely consistent with what one might have anticipated, given sufficient understanding of how Victorian London's commercial world actually operated. The corruption Holmes had uncovered was not the corruption of exceptional villainy or extraordinary cunning. It was the corruption of ordinary human accommodation to the logic of advantage. The series of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that collectively produce a system of systematic wrongdoing that no individual participant sees in its entirety or takes full responsibility for. This was what gave the case, in Watson's later reflection, its particular character, not the individual at its dramatic center, whose role, however decisive, was in a sense replaceable. Remove one principle and another would have emerged to take the operation forward, as Ord's activities demonstrated, but the system itself, the persistent underlying structure of opportunity and incentive that produce such operations with the reliability of a natural process. Holmes understood this with a clarity that Watson found both admirable and, at moments, slightly melancholy. The understanding that his work, however excellently conducted and however productive of individual justice, operated on the surface of something whose depth was beyond any individual's capacity to fully address. It was in one of these conversations, in the particular domestic peace of a December evening with the fire well attended and the fogs of the city held at bay by the double thickness of curtain and the quality of warmth that Baker Street achieved when its inhabitants chose to create it, that Watson asked Holmes the question that had been forming in his mind for several weeks, whether, given this understanding of the underlying system and its apparent persistence, he found his work, the individual investigations, the individual resolutions, satisfying in the deeper sense, the sense that reached beyond professional accomplishment to something more fundamental about purpose and result. It was a personal question of the sort that Watson asked rarely and Holmes answered rarer still, and Watson was not entirely sure he expected an answer. Holmes had considered it for a while, sitting in his chair with a stillness that indicated thought rather than avoidance, and then had said something that Watson preserved carefully in his notes and returned to frequently in later years. He had said, in substance, that the question contained a false premise, that the satisfaction of his work was not contingent on the elimination of what produced it, any more than a physician's satisfaction was contingent on the elimination of illness. The work was its own justification, not as an exercise in futility but as a practice in service of something real and immediate. The particular individual who had been wronged, the specific wrong that had been committed, the concrete question of whether that wrong would be exposed and its perpetrator held accountable. These things mattered in themselves, regardless of whether the larger system that had produced them was susceptible to improvement. And in any case, he had added, with a slight amusement that occasionally colored his most serious observations, the question of whether the larger system was susceptible to improvement was not one he was in a position to answer, being a detective rather than a philosopher or a politician. He found that specialization, he said, on the whole advantageous. Watson had laughed at this. The particular laugh of a man who has been offered a genuine thought in a form designed to be received lightly, and the evening had continued in the agreeable combination of silence and occasional conversation that was, in Watson's experience, the finest register of his friendship with Holmes, the register in which all the things that could not be said directly were nevertheless fully present and fully understood by both. The Crispin-Ord inquiry was eventually concluded, some 2 months after it had begun, in a manner less dramatic than the Scarlet merchant resolution but no less complete in its legal consequences. Ord himself, confronted with a case that Holmes and Lestrade had constructed with care sufficient to satisfy even the most demanding evidentiary standard, produced, with the calculation of a man assessing his own interests under pressure, a cooperation that yielded additional material regarding both the new operation and, more significantly, certain aspects of the Southwark organization's history and connections that had not been fully established during the earlier investigation. This cooperation was of sufficient value to the official investigation to produce, for Ord, an outcome somewhat more lenient than his actual criminal participation warranted, which was a feature of the legal process that Holmes observed without visible comment, recognizing it as both a practical necessity and an illustration of the kind of imperfect compromise that the achievement of real justice usually required. The additional material produced by Ord's cooperation had one element that was, for Holmes, of particular interest. It confirmed, with a specificity that had not previously been available, the connection between the organizations Holmes had investigated and a third entity. Not an operating commercial firm in any obvious sense, but a network of coordination, a set of recurring relationships and shared financial interests that linked the Southwark operation, the new connection Ord had been establishing, and several other operations of similar character that Holmes had tracked intermittently over the preceding years. This network was not, in any simple sense, an organization. It had no name, no formal structure, no identifiable center, but it had persistence and coherence and a shared interest in the maintenance of its opacity, and it was, Holmes concluded, the most important thing the Scarlet merchant investigation had revealed. Not the individual crime but the infrastructure that enabled individual crimes of this type to occur and to be repeated. What Holmes did with this conclusion was characteristic of him. He added it to his index, he communicated it in general terms to Lestrade and, through the Whitehall contact, to the relevant government department, and he returned to Baker Street and to the violin and the chemistry and the waiting. The network was real, its significance was real, and it would produce further cases in due course, cases that he would investigate with the same thoroughness and the same combination of patience and conviction. But it was not something that could be destroyed by a single investigation, however brilliant, any more than a river could be stopped by the removal of one stone from its bed. The acknowledgement of this limitation was not defeat. It was simply an accurate reading of the terrain. The winter deepened over London, and Baker Street acquired its December character. The early darkness, the increased warmth of the rooms against the cold outside, the particular quality of the gaslight on the familiar objects of Holmes's habitation, the smell of coal smoke and the distant sound of Christmas commerce in the streets below. Watson visited when his practice permitted, and the two men sat in the familiar configuration of their friendship, and occasionally Holmes played the violin. Not the nervous, dissonant playing of agitated thought but the flowing, meditative kind that indicated a mind at rest, a mind that had expended its energy on a completed task and was now returning to the fundamental pleasures of its existence. In such moments Watson was most fully aware of what he valued in his friendship with Holmes. Not the adventures, not the drama of the cases, not even the intellectual stimulation, though all of these were real and considerable, but something quieter and more essential, the quality of being in the presence of a mind that was genuinely committed to understanding things correctly. Holmes's commitment to accuracy, to the precise rendering of what was actually the case as distinct from what was comfortable or convenient or dramatic to believe, was in Watson's view his most important quality, the quality that made his friendship both challenging and nourishing, that kept Watson honest in his own thinking and clear in his own perceptions, that prevented the comfortable slide into the imprecision that domestic life, even the most satisfying domestic life, tends to encourage. The violin played on into the December evening, the fire burned steadily, the fog pressed against the windows, and outside the great city continued its unceasing activity. Its commerce and its crime, its ambition and its poverty, its public faces and its private realities, the endless human drama that the foggy London nights both concealed and somehow intensified, making everything at once more and less visible, reducing the familiar to strangeness and the strange to a kind of muffled, ambiguous familiarity. Watson sat with his book open in his lap and listened, and thought about what he had witnessed over the preceding weeks, and found himself, as he often did, grateful for the work, for the friendship, for the city, for the inexhaustible supply of human complexity that made both work and friendship perpetually necessary and perpetually rewarding. Holmes drew the final notes of the piece to a close and sat for a moment with the violin in his lap, looking into the fire, and then turned to Watson with a specific expression, rare but unmistakable, that meant he had something to say that was not professionally motivated, not part of any case or inquiry, but simply the direct communication of a thought for its own sake. He said, Watson recorded later, that the Farr case had been interesting in particular because of the geometry of its construction, the way that each element of the deception had been designed not merely to conceal the truth but to suggest an alternative, plausible, innocent explanation that would satisfy most observers most of the time. The construction of a successful deception, Holmes observed, required not merely the removal of incriminating evidence but the installation of explanatory evidence, and the quality of the deception in the Farr case had been such that, without the specific combination of elements that had drawn his attention on that October morning, it would almost certainly have remained as the world had initially seen it, a sad and slightly embarrassing natural death in an inconvenient location. The imperfections that had undone it, the missing glove, the displaced lining of the pocket, the small bruise on the forearm, the grain and character of the pencil marks on the card, were, he said, the equivalent of the barely audible note in a piece of music that tells the trained ear something has been altered from the original. Most ears do not hear it. But the note is there. Watson thought about this for a long time after Holmes had returned to his music, and then wrote it down with the care he brought to remarks of this kind, remarks that contained, beneath their apparently technical character, something that resonated beyond the specific case and said something about the general conditions of perception and attention, about what it meant to see carefully and completely rather than conventionally and selectively. He had spent enough time in Holmes's company to understand that this quality of attention, the willingness to hear the barely audible note, to register the improperly displaced pocket lining, to treat the apparently insignificant as potentially significant until it could be confirmed otherwise, was not a natural gift in any simple sense, though it had a natural component, but a disciplined practice, something cultivated and maintained through long effort and through the specific quality of commitment to accuracy that was Holmes's most fundamental intellectual value. It was this, Watson thought, more than the dramatic resolutions, more than the brilliant deductions, more than even the remarkable range and depth of Holmes's knowledge, that constituted his most important contribution to the project that the two of them had, over the years, been engaged in together, the project not just of solving cases but of demonstrating, through the accumulation of those solved cases, what careful, patient, committed attention to the world as it actually was. Not as one wished it to be, not as convention said it should be, but as it actually, precisely, specifically, materially was, what that quality of attention could achieve. In a world that offered constant incentives to inattention, to the comfortable elision of inconvenient details, to the interpretive shortcuts of habit and assumption, Holmes stood as a demonstration of another possibility. That it was possible to see clearly, if one was willing to pay the price of seeing clearly, and that seeing clearly was not merely an intellectual pleasure but a service to the actual people in the actual world whose actual situations were illuminated by it. The December evening deepened outside, and the city moved through its immemorial business, and Baker Street held its warmth against the cold, and Watson turned a page of his book and was content, and Holmes played on. It was in the third week of October, midway between the discovery of Farr's body and the night of the warehouse observation, that Holmes received a visit from a man he had not expected, and that the investigation took a turn whose direction Watson had not anticipated. The man was elderly, past 70, Watson estimated, though his bearing had the particular compressive dignity of a man who had been physically imposing in his prime and had not entirely relinquished that quality to age. And he arrived at Baker Street at an hour when visitors were not usually expected, the late evening, when the city had settled into its nocturnal rhythms and Baker Street itself was quiet enough that the sound of his cab drawing up was clearly audible through the closed windows of the sitting room. Holmes had known who it was before Mrs. Hudson announced the name, which was Sir Clement Ayrwood, and the expression with which he received this information was one Watson could only describe as a careful neutrality, the expression of a man who had been anticipating a visit without being certain it would come, and who wished to receive the visitor without conveying either that anticipation or any premature assessment of its significance. Sir Clement Aylward was a name that Watson, even in his imperfect knowledge of the city's commercial hierarchies and social arrangements, recognized without difficulty. A figure of genuine eminence in the overlap between commerce, philanthropy, and public service that defined the upper strata of late Victorian life, a man whose name appeared on the letterheads of charitable institutions, on the boards of respectable companies, on the committees of bodies concerned with the governance and improvement of various aspects of London's commercial and civic life. He was, in the language of his time and world, a thoroughly sound man, a man of standing in the most complete sense, and his appearance at Baker Street in the late evening, without prior notice, was itself a datum that Holmes was clearly processing with the full attention it deserved. Sir Clement, when he entered, brought with him the atmosphere of controlled urgency that Watson had learned to associate with people in possession of information they have not yet decided entirely how to deploy. People who are conscious that what they know is significant and who have arrived at the decision to share it through a process that has not been entirely comfortable. He was dressed with the sober elegance of his class and generation, and his face, which had the kind of settled authority that comes from decades of being listened to and regarded as sound, bore at this moment the specific overlay of an anxiety he was managing rather than concealing, an anxiety that manifested itself not in the large theatrical gestures of distress but in the smaller indicators. The quality of his stillness when he sat, the particular deliberateness with which he arranged the preliminary courtesies of his visit, that Watson's medical training had made him sensitive to. What Sir Clement had come to communicate was, in its essential character, a warning. Not a direct warning, and not one whose full implication he appeared willing to make completely explicit. There was, Watson sensed, a great deal happening in what Sir Clement was not quite saying that was as important as what he was, but a warning that had the specific quality of information offered under the constraint of a competing interest, the way a man might illuminate a situation he cannot fully illuminate because full illumination would implicate him in something he has not resolved his relationship with. Holmes listened with absolute patience. His patience in such situations. With informants who were managing competing loyalties, who were disclosing partially, who needed to be given enough space to find their own way to the important thing, was, Watson thought, one of his least celebrated but most effective professional qualities. The temptation with such informants was to press, to direct, to steer toward the destination one had already decided was relevant, and this temptation, yielded to, almost always produced less than the patient alternative. Holmes never yielded to it. He allowed Sir Clement to proceed at the pace Sir Clement required, speaking when speech was invited and remaining silent when silence served better, and the result was that the conversation moved, by gradual stages, toward a disclosure that arrived feeling like the informant's own choice rather than the interrogator's achievement. The substance of what Sir Clement communicated, sifted from the protective layers of circumlocution and careful limitation that surrounded it, was this, that the individual at the center of the warehouse operation, the individual whose identity Holmes had partially established through the decoded card and was in the process of fully confirming, was known to Sir Clement in a context that was, from Sir Clement's perspective, awkward. They had served on a committee together, at some point in the past, and there had been, in the course of that service, an interaction that Sir Clement described with careful vagueness as having given him, in retrospect, a degree of unease. He had not, at the time, acted on this unease. It was not, he said, sufficiently concrete to justify action, and there were other considerations of professional courtesy and the specific social dynamics of committees of the kind in question, that had inclined him toward the more comfortable option of not acting. Now, with Farr's death in the newspapers and certain other information, which he declined to specify, having come to his attention in the preceding days, he had reconsidered. He was not, he made clear, in a position to offer specific evidence of the kind that legal proceedings required. His knowledge was circumstantial, and the relevant interaction he described had produced in him an impression rather than a fact. But he had felt, he said, that the impression was one Holmes should know about, and the knowledge of what was being investigated had made him feel that the appropriate course, belated as it was to communicate it. Holmes thanked him with a warmth that Watson recognized as genuine rather than merely courteous. He valued, Watson knew, the particular courage it took for a man of Sir Clement's position to present himself at Baker Street with the confession of a past failure to act, and he did not undervalue such presentations, and the conversation concluded with an exchange that Watson found, in its quiet way, one of the most interesting moments of the entire investigation. when Sir Clement, rising to leave and having said the important things, paused and observed that he had known far, not well, but well enough, and that far had been, whatever his commercial failings, a man of some personal decency, who had arrived at the situation of his death through a combination of curiosity and misjudgment rather than the aggressive self-interest that characterized some who moved in the same commercial world. This observation, offered without apparent expectation of a response and received by Holmes without comment, was the most human moment of the investigation, and Watson preserved it carefully. After Sir Clement had gone, Holmes sat for a long time in thought of the specifically productive kind, the thought that is moving toward a conclusion, that is in its final approach to something definite. Before communicating to Watson a single observation that crystallized for Watson the significance of what they had heard, that Sir Clement's visit confirmed what Holmes had suspected but needed confirmation of, which was that the individual at the center of the Southwark operation had been known, in public life, to people who had found him sound. That this appearance of soundness was not merely an external performance but had been, in the relevant interactions, convincing to precisely the kinds of observers, experienced, intelligent, professionally astute, who should have been most difficult to convince. And that this was the feature of the case that made it most serious, not the particular crime at its center but the quality of the deception that had surrounded it and sustained it through years of association with people who had had every reason to look more carefully and had not. This observation connected, in Watson's mind, to something Holmes had said several days earlier, in a different context, in the middle of a quite different train of thought. About the relationship between respectability and crime in the specific environment of Victorian commercial life. Holmes had noted, with the detachment he brought to observations of this kind, that the Victorian world's tendency to treat the markers of respectability, the club memberships, the committee service, the philanthropic activity, the Belgravia house and the church attendance and the family, as a sufficient guarantee of character had two consequences that operated in opposite directions. The first was that genuinely good men were trusted, as they should be, because they had earned trust. The second was that genuinely bad men who had learned to maintain the markers of respectability were trusted, as they should not have been, because the markers were mistaken for the thing they marked. The exploitation of this second consequence was, Holmes observed, a very old feature of sophisticated criminal enterprise, and its persistence said something specific about the degree to which the Victorian world's faith in its own system of social signals exceeded the evidence for that faith. Watson had written this observation down, as he wrote down so many of Holmes's observations that seemed to him to reach beyond the immediate context of a case toward something more general and more permanent. He was not himself inclined to Holmes's analytical detachment. The human consequences of what Holmes described were, for Watson, impossible to reduce to a feature of social epistemology and would remain human consequences however clearly the structural analysis was made. But he valued the analysis as a complement to the more immediate emotional response, the way he valued the anatomist's diagram as a complement to the physician's bedside judgment, each perspective illuminating aspects of the same reality that the other perspective could not fully see. The night of Sir Clement's visit produced one further development, unconnected to the visit in its immediate origin but connected to it in its ultimate significance. Holmes received, in the last hour before midnight, a second message, not by telegram or the post, but delivered in a manner that Watson later thought reflected a considerable degree of urgency and possibly also fear. It was slipped under the door of 221B, an envelope of plain and inexpensive paper containing a single sheet on which someone had written, in a hand that showed the traces of haste rather than composition, a name and a time and a location. The name was one Holmes recognized. The time was 2 days hence, the location was in Whitechapel. Holmes examined this message with the care he gave to all documents, and Watson, watching him, could see the rapid evaluation of its significance running through his expression, the assessment of authenticity, the estimation of purpose, the calculation of risk. The message, he concluded after some minutes, was genuine in its character if not necessarily in its intentions. It had been written by someone in a state of genuine anxiety rather than calculated manipulation. The handwriting showed the specific quality of agitation that is different from either disguise or studied urgency, and the paper and the manner of delivery suggested someone without the resources or the inclination for elaborate staging. Whether the appointment it proposed was safe and straightforward or a more complex matter than it appeared, Holmes could not at this stage determine, But the name, which Watson was not given at this point but which clearly meant something specific to Holmes, made the risk of attending, subject to appropriate precautions, worth the potential return. The appointment 2 days hence W. As in Whitechapel, at a coffee house of the respectable working-class variety that existed in considerable numbers in the East End, serving the needs of the various communities, dock workers, small shopkeepers, craftsmen, the lower fringes of the commercial world, that formed the specific social texture of that district. The coffee house was on a street that Watson recognized, from earlier visits to that part of London, as one that occupied the transitional zone between the genuinely poor district to the east and the slightly more prosperous commercial area to the west, a position that gave it a mixed clientele of the kind that made it, from Holmes's perspective, a good choice for a meeting that neither party wished to be memorable. Holmes attended with a degree of caution that involved certain modifications to his appearance, not a full disguise, but the kind of minor adjustments to clothing and bearing that made him, to any casual observer, a man sufficiently unremarkable to justify inattention. The person they met. Watson had been directed to a table at a distance sufficient for observation but not for hearing, which he maintained with the patient frustration of a man who is deeply curious and professionally restrained, was a woman in early middle age, perhaps 35, whose appearance combined the marks of economic stress with a quality of personal dignity that suggested education and a conception of herself formed at a time when her circumstances had been better than they were now. She was clearly frightened, in the contained way of a person who has been frightened for some time and has developed, through long practice, the ability to function despite it rather than in the absence of it. The conversation she conducted with Holmes lasted approximately 25 minutes, during which time Watson occupied himself with a cup of coffee and the methodical observation of the coffee house other occupants. A practice he had developed in situations of this kind because it gave him something purposeful to do and because the quality of attention he maintained toward the room in Holmes's interest sometimes produced information of its own. In this case, he noticed a man 3 tables distant who had arrived within 5 minutes of themselves and had since consumed 2 cups of tea with the specific deliberateness of a man who is not primarily interested in tea, and who had twice arranged himself in a posture that placed Holmes and his informant at the edge of his line of sight. Watson could not determine with certainty whether this man was connected to their investigation or was simply a coincidence of presence, but he noted his appearance carefully, average height, compact build, the kind of clothing that conveyed nothing specific, a face that had the quality of being designed not to be remembered, and was ready to act if the quality of the man's attention changed. Nothing occurred to precipitate action, and the meeting concluded with Holmes and Watson leaving the coffee house by slightly different exits and rejoining on the street outside, where Holmes walked in silence for long enough that Watson understood the information to be of considerable significance and the processing of it to require the kind of uninterrupted attention that conversation would impede. When he spoke, it was to confirm several things Watson had suspected and to add one he had not. The woman was connected to the Southwark operation through a personal rather than commercial relationship. She had, at some point in the preceding year, been in the domestic employ of a person connected to the operation, and in that capacity had witnessed things she had not at the time understood and could not have acted on, but which, now that the newspaper accounts of Farr's death had caused her to understand them differently, had become a source of both information and fear. The information was specific and could be verified. It related to the movement of goods through the Southwark warehouse at a time and in a manner that corroborated several aspects of Holmes's existing hypothesis, and added one detail, concerning the involvement of a specific agent whose identity Holmes had suspected but not confirmed, that completed a gap in the pattern he had been constructing. The fear was for her own safety, and Holmes treated it with the full seriousness it deserved, making arrangements, quiet, practical, effective, through a contact in a different part of London, not a police contact but a personal one, to ensure that the woman's circumstances for the coming weeks were such as to reduce her immediate vulnerability without requiring her to do anything that would alert the people she feared. Watson, observing this arrangement, was struck, as he sometimes was, by the quality of Holmes's practical care for people who had been useful to him, the counterpart of the intellectual detachment that could seem, from outside, like a lack of ordinary human feeling. The detachment was real, but it operated within a framework of genuine responsibility, and the responsibility was not merely professional. The 3 days between the coffeehouse meeting and the warehouse night were, for Watson, the most internally eventful of the investigation, not because of what happened externally, which was, on the surface, a continuation of the same patient accumulation of evidence, but because of what Holmes communicated, in 2 conversations of unusual depth and frankness, about the shape of the investigation as he now saw it and the significance of what they were about to attempt. These conversations were unusual for Holmes in that they went beyond the operational briefing, the who and where and when of what they planned to do, and engaged with the why, the larger meaning of the specific events they were investigating and their relationship to the patterns of London life from which they had emerged. The first conversation took place on the evening of the penultimate day, after a dinner during which Holmes had been unusually quiet even by his own standards. Not the productive silence of concentrated thought, but the slightly different silence of a man who has arrived at a conclusion that requires, before it can be acted upon, a kind of internal acknowledgement that is distinct from intellectual conviction. He described, with the precision he brought to all descriptions, the full picture of the organization as he now understood it. Its origins, its methods, its personnel at the various levels of its hierarchy, and, most importantly, its moral character, using that word in the specific, analytical sense he tended to use it, meaning not a moral judgment but a description of the qualities that constituted the organization's essential nature. What he described was an operation that had been built not on the principle of ordinary commercial greed, though greed was certainly present and operative, but on the principle of structural exploitation of trust. Every element of its design, from the maintenance of respectable commercial appearances to the use of legitimate firms as cover for illegitimate transactions to the careful management of the relationships between its personnel, had been organized around a single strategic insight that the Victorian commercial world extended to its members a degree of presumptive trust. A trust based on shared membership in a common class and a common set of institutions, that could, by a sufficiently sophisticated operator, be exploited more reliably and more profitably than any purely criminal method. The organization had not primarily been criminal in the simple sense, it had been parasitic on legitimacy, and this parasitism was, Holmes noted, its most sophisticated and most troubling feature. Watson, listening, was aware of the implicit personal dimension of this analysis, the way it bore on what Sir Clement Airwood had communicated, on the failure of precisely the well-disposed, intelligent observers who should have noticed something to notice it, and on his own observation, during the trial, of the defendant's ability to maintain the performance of integrity under sustained evidentiary pressure. He asked Holmes. This was the question that the analysis seemed to invite and that Watson found himself unable not to ask, whether the organization's exploitation of trust implied a corresponding failure of discernment on the part of the trusting, a failure that was in some sense a moral failure rather than merely an epistemological one. Holmes had considered this carefully, in the manner of a man who does not dismiss moral questions but who prefers to approach them with the same analytical rigor he brings to other kinds of questions, and had said, in substance, that this framing was not incorrect but was incomplete. The failure of discernment was real, but its explanation was not primarily moral weakness but structural incentive, the fact that the cost of sustained skepticism in a trust-based social system is high and the benefit of it, most of the time, very low, because most people one extends trust to deserve it. The exploitation of this asymmetry was not a reflection of the moral failure of those exploited but of the moral calculation of those exploiting. A calculation that was precise and conscious and quite different from the unconscious failure of good faith that it superficially resembled. Watson had written this down in full, feeling that it was one of the most important observations Holmes had made in the course of the entire investigation, and one of the ones that spoke most directly to the larger question of what the Scarlet merchant case was actually about when its surface features were stripped away. The surface was a murder in Bermondsey, a warehouse operation in Southwark, a set of commercial frauds in the city. The underlying reality was a sustained argument about the conditions under which trust could be abused and the question of where the responsibility for that abuse properly resided. The second conversation was shorter and, in its own way, more personal. It took place the following morning, the morning of the warehouse night, over breakfast. Holmes eating with unusual appetite, Watson noted, which was a reliable indicator that he had resolved whatever had been producing the preceding day's quietness and had moved into the quality of clear-headed, energized readiness that preceded his most effective action. Holmes observed, without preamble, that the case had required of Watson a particular quality of patience and trust, and that this quality had been provided, as it always was, without reservation and without apparent cost, and that he was conscious of this and valued it in a way that his ordinary professional manner did not, perhaps, make sufficiently apparent. Watson, hearing this, said the only thing that seemed adequate, which was that the feeling was mutual and the arrangement, in his view, satisfactory to both parties, and that they had better finish their coffee before the morning got any colder. Holmes, in response, produced the particular brief smile that was his version of full agreement, and they had finished their coffee in companionable silence, and the day had proceeded toward its evening. The warehouse night had the qualities Watson had described in his earlier account of it. The cold, the fog, the sounds of the river, the quality of concentrated alertness that their position required, and that Watson maintained with the specific discipline of a former soldier who has learned the difference between the patience of waiting for something to happen and the alertness of a man who is ready for something to happen and who knows that the distinction between these two states is a matter of life. He had stood for 2 hours in the cold behind the storage bins and the dray, maintaining his position and his alertness with the thoroughness that Holmes's operational plans demanded and deserved, and he had been, during those 2 hours, aware in a way that surprised him slightly with its intensity of the quality of the moment, the precise combination of sensation and thought and readiness that constituted being fully present in a situation that required everything one had. The signal had come, and he had responded, and the rest had unfolded as Holmes described it. What Watson added to Holmes's account, in his later private reconstruction of the evening, was the moment of his own seeing. The moment when, from his position across the street as the police were entering the warehouse, he had a clear sight of the central figure being escorted through the main entrance into the foggy night, and had experienced, in that moment, the specific sensation of reality confirming itself. The alignment of the face he saw with the face he had been carrying in his mind through the preceding weeks, the confirmation that the investigation had been aimed at the right target, that the systematic, patient, scrupulous work had not been aimed at a shadow but at a reality. This confirmation was not a simple pleasure, it was accompanied by the weight of what the confirmation meant, the full human significance of having established with certainty what one had previously only believed. But it was real, and Watson valued it as one of the genuine satisfactions that the work of investigation, done well and honestly, produced. The day following Sir Clement's visit, Holmes had directed Watson to make an independent inquiry in a district of London that Watson had not previously visited in any professional capacity. The area around the commercial docks, southeast of the city proper, where the great bonded warehouses and the administrative offices of several shipping companies occupied a stretch of wharf side that was, in the language of the London trade, one of the great arteries of the empire's commerce. Watson had been given specific instructions, a name, an address, a particular object of inquiry, and had proceeded there by cab in the mid-morning, arriving at a set of buildings whose solid Georgian architecture wore the confident air of institutions that had been in place long enough to become part of the landscape rather than merely occupants of it. The specific inquiry Holmes had directed was apparently simple, to determine, by examining whatever records were available through legitimate commercial channels, whether a particular series of consignment numbers that appeared in material recovered from Farr's office, through the cooperation of Callaway, corresponded to the records held by one of the shipping agencies operating from the docks. Watson was not a man of commerce by training or instinct, and the world of manifests and bills of lading and customs certificates was not one in which he moved with any natural fluency, but he had learned, over years of assisting Holmes, that the specific skills required for this kind of inquiry were less specialized than they appeared. A combination of patience, the willingness to read carefully rather than superficially, the capacity to maintain a clear sense of what one was looking for amid the considerable volume of what one was looking at, and the social ability to present oneself as having a perfectly ordinary reason for examining the records one wished to see. He spent approximately 2 hours in the offices of the shipping agency, where a young clerk of the industrious and obliging sort assisted him with a combination of professional helpfulness and mild curiosity about why a man who was clearly a medical man rather than a commercial one was consulting shipping records. Watson's cover, the entirely genuine seeming story he had constructed, with Holmes's assistance, about the settlement of a small commercial estate, was adequate to the young clerk's curiosity, and the records themselves proved, after an hour's patient reading, to yield the specific information Holmes had been seeking, a pattern of discrepancy between the consignment numbers on the official records and those on a set of supplementary documents that had been filed with them. Documents that were, on their face, perfectly ordinary certificates of the kind generated at every stage of the shipping process, but that, when compared with the official records, showed a systematic inconsistency in the quantities recorded, an inconsistency that was not large in any single transaction but that, accumulated across the series of consignments in question, represented a considerable divergence between what the official record said had moved through the docks and what had actually moved through them. Watson recorded this information carefully, noting not just the discrepancy figures but the specific dates, the consignment numbers, the names of the agents who had handled the supplementary documentation, and anything else that seemed potentially relevant. And returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon with the satisfaction of a man who has done the job he was given well, and with the private sense that he had also seen, in the course of doing it, something he had not been looking for but that was possibly more important than what he had. The something was the name that appeared on 2 of the supplementary documents in a capacity that was, on the surface, entirely routine, as a witness to a standard commercial certification. But that Watson recognized from Holmes's briefings as belonging to a person whose connection to the Southwark operation had not, as far as Watson was aware, been previously established in any documentary form. Holmes received Watson's report with the quality of attentiveness that meant Watson had brought him something valuable, and the recognition of the additional name produced, very briefly, an expression of genuine satisfaction that was more eloquent than any verbal response. He asked 3 specific questions about the form and placement of the name in the documents, questions that Watson could answer with the precision that his careful note-taking had made possible, and then spent several minutes in the specific contemplative posture of a man integrating a new piece into a forming structure and assessing the changes its integration required. When he emerged from this, his conclusion was communicated to Watson in a sentence of particular brevity that was, however, entirely sufficient. The documentary connection they now had was the link between the shipping operation and the commercial network at the city end, the link that connected the physical movement of goods through the docks to the financial transactions in the commodity markets that gave the operation its ultimate profitability. Without this link, the case had a physical dimension and a financial dimension that existed in parallel with it. They were connected, and the connection was documented in records that neither party to the original transaction had apparently realized could be compared. This was the specific quality of evidentiary achievement that Holmes valued most in Watson's assistance. Not the dramatic moment but the careful retrieval of precisely the right information from the precisely right source, done with sufficient thoroughness that it was both accurate and usable. He said so, in the indirect way he had of expressing appreciation, and Watson received it with the combination of gratification and professional matter-of-factness that their long-established relationship made natural. The remainder of that day was occupied with correspondence and consultation of a character that Watson, sitting at his own desk with his medical journals, could only partially follow. Holmes wrote several letters, made one visit, alone, to a destination he did not specify, and returned in the early evening with the focused, energized quality that Watson associated with the final stages of preparation. The correspondence included, Watson No. Ted from the volume and frequency of telegrams, several exchanges with a person or persons who were evidently contributing information from a distance, from outside London, possibly from the continent, in a rapid back and forth that Holmes conducted with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he needs and exactly how to obtain it. The information concerned, Watson gathered from the one telegram he saw, aspects of the financial instruments through which the operation moved its profits, instruments of a character sufficiently complex and international in their ramifications to require the kind of specialized knowledge that Holmes's network of contacts was very well placed to supply. There was also, that evening, a visit from an entirely unexpected direction, Holmes's brother Mycroft. Watson had met Mycroft Holmes on several occasions, enough to have formed a view of him that was both respectful and somewhat unsettled. Respectful because Mycroft's intelligence was, by any honest assessment, fully the equal of Sherlock's in its analytical quality, and unsettled because the use to which Mycroft put that intelligence was so different from Sherlock's application of his own as to seem almost a different faculty, operating in a different world toward different ends. Where Sherlock's genius was active, investigative, physical in its engagement with the actual material world, Mycroft's was static, synthetic, governmental, the kind of intelligence that sits at the center of a web of information and draws the whole picture from the incoming threads without the need to leave the Diogenes Club or the offices in Whitehall where he spent the substantial majority of his existence. Watson had always found Mycroft slightly formidable in a way that was difficult to specify precisely, a quality that had less to do with his physical presence, though he was a large man, whose bulk carried a peculiar authority, than with the sense, very strong in his company, that one was being seen and assessed with a completeness that the setting and occasion did not seem to warrant. Mycroft's visit, brief and entirely unannounced, was the kind of visit that, Watson had learned, meant something had come to the attention of the government, or of whatever specific part of the government Mycroft served, which was never entirely clear and which Watson had long since given up trying to specify. That intersected with whatever Holmes was currently engaged in, and that Mycroft had decided, for reasons he would disclose as much as he considered appropriate and no more, that a direct communication was preferable to any more indirect channel. The brothers' interaction had always had a quality that Watson found both fascinating and slightly opaque. A rapidity of mutual comprehension that went beyond ordinary conversation into something more like the comparison of two independently arrived at models of the same situation, a comparison conducted with a minimum of the verbal scaffolding that ordinary conversation required because both parties had already done most of the structural work independently. What Watson gathered from Mycroft's visit, as he gathered what he could from Holmes's briefings after such visits, was that the financial instruments connected to the Southwark operation had a dimension that extended beyond the City of London into European financial networks of a character that had attracted the attention of certain governmental bodies concerned with the regulation of such networks, not the police, but something rather more quietly authoritative. Mycroft had come, Watson believed, partly to share information and partly to ensure that Holmes's investigation was proceeding in a direction compatible with whatever the governmental response to this dimension was going to be. The relationship between the independent investigator and the organs of state was always, in such cases, potentially fraught, and it was one of the specific services that Mycroft occasionally provided to manage the friction points before they became obstacles. Holmes received all this with equanimity and with the specific quality of cooperation he maintained with his brother, a cooperation that was genuine and based on a common purpose but that was also, Watson sensed, carefully calibrated to preserve Holmes's own investigative independence, the quality he valued most and would sacrifice least readily. The outcome of the visit was, in practical terms, a confirmation that certain aspects of Holmes's evidence could be corroborated from governmental sources that would carry weight in the eventual legal proceedings, and a clear signal that whatever happened at the warehouse in 4 days' time would be observed not only by Holmes and Lestrade but by authorities whose names and precise institutional identities were not specified. Watson, aware that his own presence at 221B that evening had given him access to a meeting not originally intended for his witness, conducted himself with the discretion that such situations required, preserving what he observed in his personal notes rather than in any document he had any intention of ever making more widely available. Mycroft departed as quietly as he had arrived, and the Baker Street room settled back into their working silence, and Holmes returned to his correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who has had his position confirmed and is proceeding. It was during these preparatory days, in the spaces between the active work of the investigation, that Watson was most intensely aware of the city around him as a physical reality. As a presence that the investigation had, paradoxically, made more vivid rather than less, the way that a particular quality of attention to any subject makes the subject more rather than less apparent to the senses. The London October that surrounded the Scarlet merchant investigation was a London of particular atmospheric intensity. The fogs were among the thickest Watson could remember, producing a quality of enclosure that was not merely visual but physical, a compression of the familiar scale of streets and buildings to the immediate and the proximate, everything beyond 50 yards reduced to murk and impression. Walking through these streets, even on the most routine errand, even on the most familiar route, had the quality of navigating by memory through a landscape that was at once known and transformed, a landscape in which the ordinary landmarks existed but were visible only when one was almost upon them, emerging from the grey with a momentary clarity before being swallowed again as one moved on. This quality of the streets had a specific effect on Watson's perception of the investigation. It reinforced the sense, already present in the material of the case, of a world in which the visible surface concealed as much as it revealed, in which what was apparent to the casual eye bore an imprecise and unreliable relationship to what was actually the case. The fog was, in Watson's private and slightly literary mind, the appropriate atmospheric accompaniment to an investigation of this kind. One concerned precisely with the maintenance and penetration of concealment, with the gap between appearance and reality in its most consequential form. He knew that Holmes would have rejected this as romantic fancy, and he did not share it with him, but he held it privately as one of the images through which the case became available to his own understanding, and in this private mode it served its purpose. One particular afternoon, the afternoon of the day before the warehouse night, Watson had been directed to make a specific observation in the vicinity of Tuley Street, an observation that required him to spend approximately 2 hours on a stretch of pavement near the entrance to a particular court, in the ostensible role of a man waiting for a person who was late, a role that required no particular skill to perform convincingly since it was, in its essence, a role performed daily by hundreds of Londoners and demanded of the performer only the patience and the mild, unfocused expression of someone engaged in the specific occupation of waiting. What he observed from this position, in addition to the expected foot traffic of the area, the various working men and women and delivery boys and occasionally more prosperous passers-through who constituted the human geography of that stretch of Tuley Street on a midweek afternoon, was the warehouse that had been, for the preceding week, the focus of Holmes's attention. The Southwark Storage and Shipping Company's premises were, in their external appearance, exactly what their name suggested, a large, solidly built warehouse of mid-century construction, faced in dark brick, with an iron gate in the commercial Gothic style of the 1860s and a pair of loading doors of the heavy, practical variety that gave directly onto the street. There was nothing about it, to the casual eye, that distinguished it from 100 similar buildings in the vicinity. The same combination of functional solidity and absolute uncommunicativeness about its internal activity, the same occasional movement of goods and personnel that suggested regular commercial business of an entirely unremarkable character, the same complete absence of anything that might draw the eye or excite the attention. This was, Watson understood, precisely the point. The warehouse's most important characteristic was that it looked exactly like what it purported to be, and looked it so consistently and convincingly that the eye passed over it without arrest, which was the operational condition that those who ran it had gone to considerable care to create and maintain. But Watson, attending to it with the specific quality of observation that Holmes had taught him, the observation that registers not just what is present but what is unusual, not just what is happening but what deviates from what one would expect to happen, noticed, over the 2 hours of his watch, two things that were individually minor and collectively suggestive. The first was that the personnel who moved in and out of the loading doors included, on 2 separate occasions, men whose clothing and bearing combined features of 2 different social categories in a way that was slightly incongruous, men who had the appearance and movement of working men but who, in certain details, the quality of their boots, the specific cut of a coat, an occasional gesture or attitude, showed markers of a different social origin. This combination was not impossible and was not, by itself, remarkable. People moved between social levels in Victorian London more than the neat stratifications of the official picture suggested. But in the specific context of a warehouse that Holmes was watching for signs of unusual activity, it was worth noting. The second was a vehicle. A cart had drawn up at the loading doors during Watson's watch, had been loaded with several crates of moderate size, and had departed. All of this was entirely ordinary commercial warehouse activity. What was slightly less ordinary was the destination toward which the cart moved when it left, not east or south, as the direct routes toward the docks would have required, but west, toward the city, which was an unusual direction for a loaded goods vehicle departing from a riverside warehouse unless its cargo had a very specific and non-obvious destination. Watson noted the markings on the cart side panel, which were distinctive enough to be useful, and the broad route it took for the portion of its journey he was able to observe, and reported both to Holmes that evening. Holmes, hearing this, had produced the specific brief nod that indicated the information was both expected and useful. Expected because it fitted a pattern he had already hypothesized, useful because it provided a concrete corroboration of an aspect of the pattern for which he had previously had only circumstantial support. The cart's markings identified a carrier whose name appeared, when Holmes checked it against his records, in connection with a city address that was, in its own way, as suggestive as the Southwark warehouse itself. the registered address of a small import agency whose official activity was the entirely routine business of commodity certification, but which had, on Holmes's earlier inspection of the corporate registry, a directorial connection, indirect, by 2 removes, but traceable, to the Southwark operation. This connection was the final piece that completed, for Holmes, the basic geography of the operation. The map of the routes by which goods moved from the docks through the warehouse and into the city's legitimate commercial stream, with their documentation altered sufficiently to conceal both their origin and the identity of those who had profited from their movement. The map was now complete enough to be understood, and what it revealed was both more complex and more efficient than Watson had imagined. A system that had been designed with real sophistication to maintain, at every stage, the appearance of entirely legitimate commercial activity, and that achieved this maintenance through the careful distribution of knowledge, ensuring that no individual participant in the system, below the level of the directing principle, possessed enough of the whole picture to recognize what the picture actually showed. This was the specific genius of the operation, Holmes observed, and it was also, from the perspective of investigation, its specific vulnerability. The distribution of knowledge that protected the operation's individual participants from full understanding also meant that the evidence of the full picture was distributed across multiple records and multiple individuals, none of whom had individually hidden it. It had not been hidden because no one individual had known enough to recognize it as something to be hidden. Holmes had assembled it from fragments, each innocuous in isolation, because his position outside the system gave him an overview that no insider possessed, and because his method was precisely suited to the construction of patterns from apparently unrelated components. The days of preparation were, in their own way, as important to the investigation's outcome as the warehouse night itself. Holmes spent the evenings of this period in a quality of work that Watson found, in retrospect, characteristic of his method at its most elevated, not the reactive work of a man responding to events as they occurred, but the proactive work of a man constructing the conditions under which the right events would occur and would be properly witnessed when they did. He was not, in this phase, waiting for crime to present itself to him, he was creating the situation in which the crime, already committed, already ongoing, would become visible to the right people at the right moment and in the right form. This was a different kind of work from the detection that preceded it, and it required a different kind of mind. Not the analytical mind that had decoded the card and traced the organization, but the strategic mind that could see the desired outcome and work backward from it to the specific actions that would produce it, accounting for the various ways in which those actions might go wrong and making provision for each of them. Watson observed all of this with the admiration of long familiarity. An admiration that was the more genuine for being entirely unsentimental, based not on the idealization of a friend's qualities but on the direct evidence of their operation. He had seen Holmes at his best and at his worst, had seen him brilliant and occasionally mistaken, confident and occasionally uncertain, energized and occasionally depressed, and what the totality of this observation had produced was not a simplified picture of extraordinary capability but a complex and fully human one, in which the extraordinary capability was real but not supernatural, bounded by the same conditions of imperfect information and irreducible uncertainty that bounded everyone's capacity for judgment, and valuable in proportion to the care and discipline and genuine commitment to accuracy with which it was exercised. The night before the warehouse visit, Watson had slept badly, which was unusual for him in the ordinary course of his domestic life but not unusual in the proximity of this kind of operation, and he had spent the early hours in the particular half-conscious state that is not quite sleep and not quite waking, reviewing the case in its accumulated detail with the slightly unreliable editorial faculty of the drowsing mind. Sometimes seeing it clearly, sometimes seeing it through the distortions of partial sleep that turned its facts into images of a more vivid and less accurate kind. He had woken fully at 6, dressed with the specific thoroughness of a man preparing for a day that demands complete readiness, and had breakfasted at Baker Street with Holmes in the particular quiet of a morning on which important events were expected, a quiet that was not tension precisely but a focused, attentive alertness, the quality of a man who is at the top of his form and knows it. Holmes had been, that morning, in a state of almost entire external tranquility. The state Watson associated with complete preparation, with the specific condition of a man who has done everything in his power to be ready and who therefore has nothing further to do but wait for events to provide their own occasions. He had eaten a good breakfast, had read the morning papers with the ordinary attention of a man conducting ordinary daily business, and had spoken to Watson about several topics that had nothing to do with the Scarlet merchant case. About a paper on experimental method he had been reading in one of the scientific journals, about the seasonal shift in the quality of the London fog and its relationship to coal consumption patterns, about a small observation he had made during his early morning walk concerning a particular feature of the Baker Street pavement that had interested him. These conversations were not, Watson understood, displacement activity or deliberate distraction. They were the authentic expression of a mind that was genuinely capable of engaging with multiple things simultaneously, and that found no contradiction between its investment in the evening's operation and its appreciation of the morning's smaller intellectual pleasures. It was only in the mid-morning, when Holmes turned from the paper and the conversation to a period of sustained silence and the specific stillness of concentrated thought, that the investment in the evening became fully apparent, and Watson had left him to it, taking his hat and coat and spending the hours before their midday consultation in a walk through the fog that he had, privately, designed to fulfill the same preparatory function for himself that Holmes's stillness fulfilled for him. A clearing of the mind, a settling of the various anxieties that the day's known demand produced into a form of ordered readiness rather than unproductive worry. London, walked through in this state, was a city of extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary mystery in equal measure. The fog compressed it to the immediately present, every street was its own complete world, bounded by the grey at either end, every passerby a briefly vivid individual before being swallowed again into the murk. And this compression had the effect of making everything, from the quality of the cobbles under his boots to the specific sound of a particular vendor's cry, unusually immediate and distinct. Watson walked without direction, allowing the city to present itself in its customary variety, and found that the walk produced precisely the effect he had hoped for, a settling of attention into the present. A replacement of the diffuse anxiety of anticipation with the specific, grounded alertness of a man who is engaged with the actual rather than the anticipated. He returned to Baker Street at noon, and they lunched, and the afternoon passed in its final preparation, and the evening came, and with it the fog and the cold and the sounds of the river and the particular quality of a night that carried within it the potential of things that had not yet happened but were on their way. The river was always, for Watson, the most essential thing about London south of the bridge, the thing that gave the geography of the South Bank its specific character, the thing that explained why these streets had formed in these patterns and why these wharves existed in these places and why the fog, when it came in from the Thames estuary and moved upstream with the tide, had a quality specific to this part of the city that could not be found anywhere else. He had grown up far from the sea and far from any great river, and the Thames had always had for him the quality of a thing perpetually fresh and perpetually ancient, a waterway that had been moving through this landscape since before any of the buildings that surrounded it had existed, that had watched the city build itself on its banks over centuries, and that would watch the city change again and again after everything currently standing had been replaced by something else. The specific character of the Thames at night, the way the water moved in its dark, tidal surge, the way it caught the lights of the bridges and the wharves in bright, fleeting fragments, the way it smelled of everything it carried, was the most permanent quality of London, the quality that remained constant beneath all the changes of surface and form that the city perpetually underwent. Watson thought about this, standing in the cold and the fog beside the storage bins during the long wait, and found that it gave him, in a way he could not entirely articulate, a quality of steadiness. The permanence of the river, its absolute indifference to the specific dramas of the human beings it passed through, its continuation regardless of what they did or did not do, was not a diminishment of those dramas but a context for them, a reminder that the specific anxieties of any given night were specific, bounded, finite, whatever their felt urgency, and that the larger thing of which they were a part was vaster and more enduring than any single investigation however consequential. He heard Holmes's signal, and responded, and the machinery of the operation proceeded as it had been designed to proceed, and the night resolved itself into the morning's aftermath, and the morning's aftermath into the weeks of legal consequence, and the weeks of legal consequence into the year's end and the beginning of a new year, and the gradual recession of the Scarlet merchant investigation into the background of cases that had been completed and were now available as memories and as evidence of what careful attention to the world could achieve. The river was always, for Watson, the most essential thing about London south of the bridge. the thing that gave the geography of the South Bank its specific character, the thing that explained why these streets had formed in these patterns and why these wharves existed in these places and why the fog, when it came in from the Thames estuary and moved upstream with the tide, had a quality specific to this part of the city that could not be found anywhere else. He had grown up far from the sea and far from any great river, and the Thames had always had for him the quality of a thing perpetually fresh and perpetually ancient, a waterway that had been moving through this landscape since before any of the buildings that surrounded it had existed, that had watched the city build itself on its banks over centuries, and that would watch the city change again and again after everything currently standing had been replaced by something else. The specific character of the Thames at night, the way the water moved in its dark, tidal surge, the way it caught the lights of the bridges and the wharves in bright, fleeting fragments, the way it smelled of everything it carried, was the most permanent quality of London, the quality that remained constant beneath all the changes of surface and form that the city perpetually underwent. Watson thought about this, standing in the cold and the fog beside the storage bins during the long wait, and found that it gave him, in a way he could not entirely articulate, a quality of steadiness. The permanence of the river, its absolute indifference to the specific dramas of the human beings it passed through, its continuation regardless of what they did or did not do, was not a diminishment of those dramas but a context for them, a reminder that the specific anxieties of any given night were specific, bounded, finite, whatever their felt urgency, and that the larger thing of which they were a part was vaster and more enduring than any single investigation, however consequential. He heard Holmes's signal, and responded, and the machinery of the operation proceeded as it had been designed to proceed, and the night resolved itself into the morning's aftermath, and the morning's aftermath into the weeks of legal consequence, and the weeks of legal consequence into the year's end and the beginning of a new year, and the gradual recession of the Scarlet merchant investigation into the background of cases that had been completed and were now available as memories and as evidence of what careful attention to the world could achieve. There was, in the aftermath of the warehouse night, a period of 2 days during which neither Holmes nor Watson spoke about what had happened. Not from any embarrassment or discomfort, but from the particular quality of post-resolution quiet that these operations tended to produce, a quality in which the urgency of the preceding weeks had been discharged and the consequences were now in the hands of the legal machinery, and there was, temporarily, nothing active to be done. Holmes spent most of these 2 days in his armchair, in what Watson recognized as the specific post-case state that followed his most demanding investigations. Not depression, though to those who did not know him it might have resembled it, but something more like the recovery of a very powerful engine that has been running at full capacity and requires, before it can return to that capacity, a period of reduced operation. He slept more than usual, ate more than usual, played the violin in long, meditative passages that were not the nervous, angular playing of agitated thought but the sustained, melodic playing of a mind that has temporarily set down its analytical burden and is engaging with something purely sensory. Watson visited both days and sat with him, and they talked about things unrelated to the case, and it was precisely this ordinariness of their interaction that Watson found most meaningful. The implicit statement it made, in its very unremarkableness, about the quality of their friendship and its capacity to contain both the heights of shared investigation and the quietness of ordinary companionship without either diminishing the other. On the third day, Holmes was up before Watson arrived, his coat damp from an early morning walk, his attention already reorganized from the completed case to the next material his mind had found to engage with. He had received, during the 2 days of relative quiet, 3 letters whose senders and subjects were not disclosed to Watson, and one of these had apparently provided the thread that his mind required to move from rest to its characteristic active state. The transition was, as always, rapid. One of the qualities Watson most admired and occasionally envied was Holmes's ability to move cleanly between states without the residual drag that most people experienced, the tendency to carry the previous state's quality into the new one. When Holmes was done with something, he was done with it entirely, in the way that a very good surgeon is done with one procedure the moment the next patient is on the table. The letter that had reactivated Holmes's attention was, he eventually communicated to Watson, related to the fire investigation in its origins but not in its current form. It concerned a development in the commercial consequences of the Southwark operations disruption that was producing, in certain adjacent areas of the commodity trade, a set of secondary effects whose character Holmes found interesting. the specific nature of these effects was initially presented to Watson in terms that were deliberately general, reflecting Holmes's practice of introducing new lines of inquiry at the level of generality appropriate to their current development and increasing specificity as the inquiry became more settled. What Watson gathered was that the disruption of one element of a commercial network did not, as a rule, simply remove that element without consequence. It produced, rather, a redistribution of activity, as those who had depended on the disrupted element sought other channels and as those who had been in competition with it moved to fill the space it had vacated. These redistributions were, in Holmes's view, as informative about the network structure and extent as the original element had been, perhaps more so, because they were less carefully managed and consequently more revealing of the underlying pattern. This was the specific insight that connected the aftermath of the Scarlet merchant investigation to the Crispin-Ord inquiry that followed it, and Watson's later understanding of the relationship between these two inquiries owed much to Holmes's articulation of this principle. The investigation of a crime, done thoroughly, produced not merely the resolution of the specific crime but a map, imperfect, incomplete, always subject to revision but progressively more accurate, of the larger landscape in which the crime had been embedded, and this map was, from Holmes's perspective, the most important product of the investigation in the long run, because it was the foundation on which the next investigation would be built. Watson had asked, on one of the evenings of that first post-case week, whether Holmes found the accumulation of this map, the growing picture of London's criminal landscape in its structural complexity, encouraging or discouraging. The question was personal in a way that Watson knew might produce deflection, and he had asked it with the awareness that Holmes might choose not to answer it directly. But Holmes had answered, with the specific quality of a man who has been asked something he has already thought about carefully and who welcomes the opportunity to articulate what he has concluded. He had said that the question was based on a view of the criminal landscape as fixed, as a thing of determinate size whose reduction was measurable and whose ultimate elimination was at least theoretically conceivable. His own view was different. The criminal landscape was, like the legitimate one of which it was a shadow, continuously generated by the same conditions that generated human society itself, by the combination of scarcity and desire and the imperfect alignment of rules with the realities they sought to govern. It was not reducible in any final sense, and the attempt to understand it as reducible was not merely mistaken but actively unhelpful, because it encouraged a conception of investigation as an essentially temporary enterprise, whose purpose was its own eventual obsolescence, rather than as a permanent and necessary practice whose value lay in its continuity rather than its termination. This was not, Holmes had added, a counsel of despair. It was a description of a condition that, correctly understood, was not hopeless but simply real. The physician who understood that illness was not a temporary abnormality that medicine would eventually eliminate but a permanent feature of the human condition was not, for that understanding, a worse physician but potentially a better one. Better because the understanding of permanence produced a quality of commitment to the individual case that the illusion of ultimate elimination could not, in practice, sustain. Watson had written this down and had thought about it for a long time after, and had found it, over the following weeks and months, one of the most useful things Holmes had ever said to him about the nature of their work. Useful not in any immediately practical sense but in the deeper sense of being an accurate description of the conditions under which the work was done, and accurate descriptions of conditions are the necessary foundation for effective action within those conditions, which is what investigation, properly understood, was. There was one further element of the Scarlet merchant investigation that Watson had not, in his initial account, given sufficient weight, partly because it had revealed itself gradually rather than in any single dramatic moment, and partly because its significance was of a kind that resisted the narrative form his accounts naturally took. Not the significance of a decisive event or a crucial clue but the significance of a sustained quality of relationship that had been, throughout the investigation and in its aftermath, more important than any single element of the evidence. This was the relationship between Holmes and a figure in the case whom Watson had described but not fully characterized, Miss Helena Vane. Watson had noted Miss Vane's visit to Baker Street, had described her courage and her intelligence and the practical value of what she had provided, and had noted Holmes's arrangement for her continued communication and his expressed concern for her safety. What he had not fully articulated was the quality of Holmes's response to her specifically. A quality that was visible to Watson precisely because it was slightly different from Holmes's usual response to informants and witnesses, however valued. Most people who came to Baker Street with useful information were received with the quality of attention that Holmes gave to all sources of evidence: concentrated, systematic, grateful in proportion to the information's value, and thereafter professional. With Miss Vane there was, in addition to all this, something that Watson, who had known Holmes long enough to recognize when something was slightly different from the norm, could only describe as recognition, the specific quality of response of someone who has encountered a mind working in a way they find genuinely impressive, in conditions that make that work genuinely admirable. What had impressed Holmes about Miss Vane? And Watson had gathered this more from what Holmes said about her in the days after her visit than from the visit itself, was not merely the practical value of her information, which was considerable, but the specific quality of observation she had brought to her situation. Working in an environment that had, over months, been producing signals of increasing significance. Signals about her employer's activities and state of mind, about the character of the transaction she was handling, about the quality and direction of the fear she was observing. She had attended to these signals with a systematic thoroughness that, given her position and the limited perspective it afforded, was remarkable. She had not simply noticed things and reacted to them emotionally, as most people in her situation would have. She had recorded them, at least in memory, with a degree of precision that had made them usable, and she had, without any training in investigation and without any encouragement from the environment around her, constructed from her observations a picture that, while incomplete, was coherent and oriented in the right direction. Holmes had noted, to Watson, that this quality, the quality of systematic, patient, unsentimental observation maintained over a period of months in conditions of private difficulty and without any external validation, was rarer than the specific analytical faculty that he himself possessed, and in some respects more admirable, because it had to be generated and maintained entirely from internal resources without the reinforcement that engagement in active investigation provided. He had also noted, with the slight dryness that characterized his more personal observations, that if more people brought to their ordinary circumstances the quality of attention that Miss Vane had brought to hers, his own professional services would be required considerably less often, which was a thought he found both flattering and slightly sobering. Watson had, at some later date, made inquiries through the channels available to him about Miss Vane's subsequent situation. Motivated by the combination of personal concern and the instinct of a chronicler who likes to know how stories continue, and had learned that she had left her position with Mr. Saltmarsh, inevitably, in the aftermath of the events that had involved him, and had found a position of greater responsibility with a commercial firm in the city whose senior partner had, through channels that Watson suspected but could not confirm had some connection to Holmes's network of professional contacts, become aware that she was a person of exceptional capability and entirely to be trusted. The position was a better one than the one she had left, in both the professional and the financial sense, and Watson permitted himself, in recording this, the satisfaction of a man who likes the world to occasionally and specifically reward what it should generally but often fails to reward: the combination of intelligence, honesty, and the willingness to act on both when action is difficult. Saltmarsh himself had emerged from the investigation in a position that reflected the ambiguity of his involvement. He had known things he had not disclosed and had thereby been implicated in events he might have prevented, but the degree of his active participation in the criminal aspects of the operation had been, in the legal assessment, sufficiently limited and sufficiently colored by circumstances of personal pressure. The specific quality of pressure that the organization brought to bear on people in Saltmarsh's position, that the legal consequences were modest in proportion to his moral culpability. Holmes, when Watson reported this outcome to him, had observed that this kind of result was among the most common features of cases involving commercial crime. The people whose involvement was most visible and most easily documented were often not the people whose moral responsibility was greatest, and the people whose moral responsibility was greatest were often those whose care in creating distance between their own position and any documentable involvement was most elaborate. The remedy for this asymmetry was not available within the current legal framework, and Holmes, who was not given to the kind of legal reformism that some of his acquaintances found appealing, contented himself with observing it rather than proposing solutions. Lestrade had been, in the aftermath of the warehouse operation, in the specific professional position that resulted, for him, from a successful collaboration with Holmes. a position of credit considerably in excess of the methodological contribution he had personally made to the investigation, but one that he occupied, as Watson observed, with a certain self-knowledge that was more acute than his professional public face suggested. He had expressed to Watson, in a private moment at the conclusion of the legal proceedings, something that Watson had not expected from Lestrade and that he valued accordingly, a straightforward and unqualified acknowledgment. And that the case had been made by Holmes, not by the Yard, and that his own contribution had been primarily procedural, the deployment of official resources and authority to implement a strategy designed by someone else. This was not, Lestrade had added, a complaint or a reflection on the propriety of the arrangement. It was simply an accurate description of what had happened, and he had arrived at the position of being able to make it without either false modesty or resentment, which Watson recognized as a form of professional maturity that deserved respect. The formal legal process had taken the case through its various stages with the measured thoroughness of the Victorian courts, a thoroughness that Watson found, as he always did, simultaneously admirable and frustrating. Admirable in its protection of the defendant's right to a full and fair examination of the evidence against them, frustrating in the specific quality of delay and procedural complexity that this protection imposed on those who had assembled the evidence and who were waiting for the outcome with varying degrees of patience. Holmes attended the portions of the proceedings relevant to his own evidence with the professional equanimity of a man who has done this many times and who has learned to treat the adversarial examination of his work as a quality control mechanism rather than a personal challenge. He was not entirely immune to the satisfactions of the courtroom. Watson could see, on the day of Holmes's testimony, a quality of contained pleasure in the precision of his responses, in the specific economy with which he navigated the defense's attempts to find the crevices in his evidence, but he was sufficiently detached from the outcome to give his evidence without the investment of ego that occasionally produced problems for expert witnesses in such proceedings. The defense's case was made with the competence available to a barrister working with limited material, and it proceeded in a direction that the evidence required, not a denial of the facts as established, since the facts as established were too well documented and too multiply corroborated for straightforward denial to be credible, but an argument about interpretation. About whether the facts as established necessarily implied the conclusions the prosecution drew from them, about whether the gaps in the direct chain of evidence between the defendant and the specific criminal acts permitted the inference of the defendant's responsibility, and about whether the circumstantial nature of certain crucial connections was sufficient to support the burden of proof that a criminal conviction required. These were not frivolous arguments, and Watson gave them the credit they deserved. The case against the central figure was, as Holmes had acknowledged, primarily circumstantial in its most crucial element, the connection between the directing mind and the specific act of Farr's death. The fraudulent commercial activities were documented directly and irrefutably. The connection to the directing individual was established through the combination of decoded correspondence, directorial records, financial analysis, and the testimony of witnesses whose access to the relevant transactions was documented. But the final step, from the established facts of the commercial organization to the specific decision to have Farr killed, rested on the combination of motive, means, opportunity, and behavioral evidence that constituted the circumstantial case in its standard form. This was not an unusual evidentiary situation in cases involving directing principles of organized enterprises. It was, rather, the standard situation, and the court's accumulated experience of evaluating it had produced a body of guidance that the judge applied with characteristic thoroughness. The verdict was as Watson had anticipated and as Holmes had believed the evidence warranted, guilty on the primary charges, with the accessory charge on Farr's death resolved in the prosecution's favor on the balance of the evidence. The sentence was substantial. Watson observed the defendant's reception of it with the clinical detachment that experience had given him, and noted what the performance of equanimity cost a man who had spent a lifetime constructing and maintaining a reputation that the verdict had irrevocably destroyed. There was, beneath the controlled exterior, a quality of devastation that no professional dignity could quite contain, and Watson felt for it. Not the sympathy of one who believes the outcome to have been wrong, but the specific human response of one who recognizes the cost of irreversible loss even in someone who has brought that loss entirely upon themselves. Holmes, seated 2 rows behind Watson in the public gallery, had watched the verdict with the expression of a man whose attention is primarily directed toward something other than the emotional dimension of what he is witnessing. His attention, Watson suspected, was on the procedural accuracy of the outcome, on whether it correctly reflected the evidence, whether the judge's summary had given proper weight to the various elements, whether any aspect of the process had involved a misapplication of the principles it was meant to serve. If he had feelings about the individual at the center of the case, he did not show them, which was not the same as not having them but reflected the specific discipline he maintained about the separation of professional evaluation from personal response. Outside the court, in the November Street, the two of them had walked in silence for some minutes before Watson said the thing he had been wanting to say throughout the final stages of the trial and had been waiting for the right moment for. That the investigation had been, in his view, one of the most consistently excellent things he had seen Holmes do, not because of any single spectacular achievement but because of the quality of sustained systematic thinking it had required and had demonstrated throughout. Holmes had received this without the usual deflecting response, the slight dismissal, the redirection to what could have been done better or what would have been more interesting. And had said, simply, that it had been a good case, and that Watson's contribution to it had been better than he perhaps knew, and that the city was cold and they should find a cab and go home and have some tea. Watson had laughed, and they had found a cab, and had gone home, and had had some tea, and the evening had proceeded in the ordinary way of evenings after things that have gone as they should, and the city had continued outside in its enormous, indifferent, inexhaustible way, and the case of the Scarlet merchant had passed from being a current thing to being a completed one, and its place in the accumulated history of their collaboration had been established. There were 3 days, between Watson's first visit to Baker Street after the Far notice appeared in the Times and the morning Holmes received Miss Vane, during which the investigation existed in a state that Watson later described to himself as one of structured uncertainty. A state in which the facts were insufficient for any firm conclusion, in which the hypotheses were too numerous and too evenly matched for comfortable preference, and in which Holmes's response was to proceed systematically through the available avenues of inquiry with a patience that Watson, knowing him, recognized as genuine rather than performed, but that was, for Watson himself, slightly more difficult to maintain. These 3 days had their own texture and their own significance, and Watson felt that a fully honest account of the investigation required giving them their proper weight rather than compressing them, as the dramatic requirements of narrative tended to compress periods of patient accumulation into a single notation of elapsed time. On the second morning of this period, Holmes had directed their efforts toward the records of the Bermondsey tanning trade. This might have seemed, to an observer without access to Holmes's reasoning, a peculiar priority. The tanning trade was not obviously germane to the death of a city commodity merchant, and the records of a Victorian industrial trade were not, prima facie, a promising source of information about a criminal investigation. But Holmes's reasoning, when he eventually communicated it to Watson, was the specific kind of reasoning that his cases regularly produced. A chain of inference from apparently unrelated elements to a conclusion that, once stated, seemed obvious, even though no one who had not first traced the chain could have anticipated the conclusion. The specific link was the smell. Not the smell of the tanneries in general, that was simply the characteristic atmosphere of the district, but a particular note within the complex of smells that Watson had registered during their first visit to the passage, a note that Holmes had also registered, and that was, Holmes said, distinctive in a way that went beyond the general character of the leather curing process. It was the specific smell of a particular chemical compound used in the tanning process, a compound that was employed in only a small number of the Bermondsey yards, and that was, in addition to its tanning applications, a compound with other properties that Holmes had filed under a different heading in his knowledge of chemistry and its applications. The presence of this smell in the passage, and Holmes had noted it during their examination, with the specific attention he gave to olfactory evidence, which was, he had often observed, among the most underused of the investigative senses, was a datum. The question it raised was whether its presence was incidental. The passage was in Bermondsey, and Bermondsey smelled of tanning chemicals, or specific, someone connected to a particular yard that used this particular compound had been present in the passage on the relevant night. The answer to this question required knowing which yards in Bermondsey used the specific compound, a matter that the records of the trade association would answer, and of the yards that used it, which had any connection, however indirect, to the Southwark warehouse or to any of the persons Holmes had identified as connected to the Far matter. This was methodical work of the kind that Holmes did with the same quality of focused attention as the more apparently brilliant analytical leaps, because he understood that the apparently brilliant leaps were generally the product of the methodical work rather than alternatives to it. The tanning trade records were kept at the offices of the Bermondsey Tanners Association, a body of some antiquity housed in a building in Long Lane that was simultaneously very old and very clean, its ancient timbers and irregular floors maintained with the institutional pride of a trade that had governed itself for centuries and was conscious of its historical standing. The secretary of the association was a man of advanced years and meticulous professional habits, who received Holmes and Watson with the combination of courtesy and mild puzzlement that the unexpected arrival of two gentlemen of evident quality at the offices of a trade association in Bermondsey tended to produce, and who was, after Holmes had explained the nature of his inquiry in terms sufficiently general to be unobjectionable, remarkably helpful in the specific and useful way of a man who has spent decades accumulating and organizing a particular category of information and who takes a professional satisfaction in demonstrating its accessibility. The records confirmed that 3 yards in the relevant district used the specific compound Holmes was interested in, 2 of them adjacent to each other and operated under a common management, and 1 standing alone on a stretch of riverfront approximately quarter of a mile from the passage where Farr had been found. Holmes examined the details of all 3 with the care he brought to such examinations, and noted 3 things of potential significance. That the management of the 2 adjacent yards had, approximately 18 months previously, changed hands in a transaction that had required certain regulatory approvals from the association, approvals that had been granted without difficulty but that had been notable at the time for the identity of the new management, which had included, in a minority capacity, a name that Watson recognized from Holmes's earlier briefings as belonging to the network of associations surrounding the Southwark operation, that the single yard had been cited, in the association's records, for an infringement of the loading regulations at its riverside access point, an infringement that had been recorded approximately 6 weeks previously and that had involved an irregularity in the movement of goods during nighttime hours. And that this same yard had, on the night of Farr's death, filed a return with the association recording an emergency maintenance procedure that had required the yard to be active during the small hours, a return that was procedurally regular but that had, apparently, not been anticipated in the yard's advanced scheduling. Holmes absorbed all this with the specific quality of attention that Watson had come to associate with the registration of useful evidence. The attention of a man who is receiving information he has expected and is confirming its fit with an existing hypothesis, while simultaneously noting the elements that require further consideration. He thanked the association's secretary with genuine warmth, which was unusual enough to produce, Watson noticed, a slight increase in the secretary's pleased expression, and they returned to the street with a set of observations that, while not individually decisive, added another layer to the pattern Holmes was constructing. On the 3rd morning, Holmes had dispatched Watson on an errand of a quite different character. To the home of a physician who had been the regular medical attendant of Mr. Farr, a physician named Dr. Aubrey Walcott, whose practice was in Kensington not far from Farr's own home and who had presumably, in the normal course of his professional relationship with Farr, developed a knowledge of his patient's medical history and physical condition that was relevant to the question of the cause of death. Holmes had explained his reason for this visit in terms that Watson immediately understood. The attribution of Farr's death to cardiac causes was more or less plausible in proportion to the actual state of his cardiac health, and the divisional surgeon in Bermondsey, operating without any knowledge of Farr's medical history, had been unable to assess this question. Walcott, if he was forthcoming, could provide information that would either strengthen or weaken the cardiac explanation, which was itself relevant to the question of whether there was anything to investigate. Watson had conducted medical interviews of this kind often enough, with colleagues, in professional rather than investigative contexts, and in Holmes's service on several previous occasions, to know how to approach them. The medical profession had its own norms of discretion and professional confidence, and those norms created a specific dynamic in interviews about deceased patients, where the usual constraints of the living patient's right to privacy were relaxed but not entirely dissolved, and where the interviewing physician had to navigate between the legitimate interest of the inquiry and the professional traditions of his own craft. Watson navigated this dynamic with the combination of professional respect and clear purpose that it required, and Walcott, a careful, intelligent man of about 50, whose practice combined the general medicine of a good Kensington GP with a specific interest in what would now be called preventive care, was both cooperative and useful. Farr, Walcott told Watson, had been in his care for some 7 years, and had been, over that period, a patient whose medical history was more interesting than his apparently robust physical constitution suggested. He had a history of a specific cardiac arrhythmia, not a dramatic or immediately dangerous condition in its normal presentation, but one that, in certain circumstances, could produce a sudden and severe cardiac event. This condition had been managed successfully through a combination of medication and the restriction of certain activities and exposures, and Farr had, in Walcott's professional assessment, been in reasonable health for his age and condition at his most recent consultation, which had been some weeks before his death. However, and this was the element that Watson judged most important, Walcott had noted at that consultation a slight but concerning increase in the frequency of the arrhythmic episodes, and had raised, in consequence, the possibility of adjusting the medication. Farr had declined this adjustment, citing a preference for waiting to see whether the increase resolved itself, which was medically not unreasonable but which Walcott had noted with some professional unease. The implication of this history, for the question of cause of death, was nuanced. On one hand, it provided a genuine medical basis for a cardiac event. The arrhythmia was real and its potential for severity was real, and this meant that the death as natural causes explanation was not merely a convenient fiction but a medically plausible account that a physician aware of the history might have endorsed. On the other hand, the specific character of the arrhythmia, Walcott had described it in terms that Watson, with his medical background, understood precisely. Was one that was, in principle, susceptible to certain interventions that could provoke an event in a susceptible patient. This was not the same as saying that Farr had been murdered, but it was the same as saying that Farr's medical history, far from ruling out the possibility of induced death, actually provided a more specific and more credible mechanism for it than the general cardiac explanation suggested. Watson had returned to Baker Street with this information and had provided it to Holmes with the combination of medical precision and investigative context that it required. Holmes had listened with the quality of attention that meant he was integrating the information into his existing model with significant results, and had then said, with the quiet certainty that he reserved for conclusions he was prepared to stake on, that the medical history confirmed his hypothesis rather than contradicting it, and that the specific character of the arrhythmia, combined with the compound he had identified through the tanning trade records, produced a mechanism that was both medically feasible and consistent with the physical evidence the divisional surgeon had observed but not fully evaluated. Watson understood this immediately, and the understanding was accompanied by the specific quality of discomfort that attaches to the moment when a death that might have been natural is established, even provisionally, as having been deliberately produced. The discomfort was not doubt, the logic was compelling, but the weight of what the logic implied. That someone had known enough about Farr's medical condition and had possessed enough technical knowledge about the relevant compound to construct a method of killing that would, without a specifically directed investigation, pass for the natural death that Farr's medical history made entirely plausible. This was not the crude violence of the ordinary criminal case. It was something considerably more sophisticated and considerably more cold-blooded, and it said something specific and disturbing about the character of whoever had planned it. Holmes, who had arrived at this conclusion somewhat before Watson, had already moved beyond its emotional impact to its investigative implications, which were primarily two, that the method implied access to specific knowledge about Farr's medical condition, which meant either a source in the medical establishment or a level of personal familiarity with Farr that went beyond professional contact, and that the method implied resources and contacts of a specific and unusual kind, which was further evidence for the organized character of whatever had been behind the killing. Both implications reinforced the direction of the inquiry Holmes was already pursuing, and he noted them with the precision of a man who is adding useful data to an already substantially formed picture rather than discovering that the picture needs to be redrawn. That afternoon had been occupied with a different kind of inquiry. Holmes had taken Watson to visit a person who was not, in any formal sense, a witness or an informant, but who occupied a position in the specific commercial world relevant to the investigation that made his knowledge potentially useful. This was a man named Trevithick, a retired factor in the commodity trade who had spent 30 years buying and selling on behalf of various city houses and who had, in the ordinary course of a long career, developed a knowledge of the personal and commercial dynamics of the trade that was, Holmes judged, precisely the kind of contextual intelligence that documented sources could not provide. Trevithick lived in Islington, in a house that was smaller than his former commercial standing might have suggested, and that was, Watson noted, filled with the accumulated evidence of a life in trade. Samples and specimens and the various detritus of commercial samples, alongside a collection of books that were almost entirely commercial in their subject matter, together with a cat of advanced years and complete self-possession who occupied the best chair in the sitting room and regarded Holmes and Watson with the specific equanimity of a creature that has long since resolved the question of its own importance to its own satisfaction. Trevithick himself was a compact, sharp-featured man of perhaps 65, with the particular quality of alertness that commercial life at its most competitive tends to produce in those who survive it, an alertness that registered people and situations rapidly and accurately and that expressed itself, in conversation, as a combination of directness and the specific economy of expression of a man who has spent his career in environments where imprecise communication was expensive. He knew far, and he knew the commodity trade, and he knew the Southwark Company at least by reputation, and his knowledge of all three was the practical, unrefined knowledge of direct experience rather than the more formal knowledge of documents and records, and it was precisely for this reason that Holmes valued it. What Trevithick provided, over the course of an hour and a half of conversation, was something that Watson later described as the human geography of the investigation. The personal connections, the reputations, the long-standing relationships and enmities and commercial dependencies that formed the actual social texture of the world in which Farr had operated and in which his death had its ultimate roots. He knew, for example, that Farr had been, for some years, in a commercial rivalry with certain elements of the trade that had been intense enough to produce, on several occasions, the kind of maneuvering that was only visible to someone with Trevithick's insider knowledge and that had left traces, in the form of specific transactions and specific relationships, that were relevant to understanding how Farr had arrived at the situation Holmes was investigating. He knew also that the Southwark operation, though he had not identified it as the Southwark Storage and Shipping Company specifically, had been a subject of private speculation among those in the trade who were attentive to such things, not as a suspected criminal enterprise but as an operation whose efficiency and pricing were slightly puzzling to competitors who could not see its internal economics. This observation, the puzzle of the operation's pricing, was, for Holmes, one of the most useful things Trevithick provided. It was the commercial equivalent of a symptom, the external sign of an internal condition that was, on the surface, invisible but that could be inferred from the specific anomaly of a pricing structure that was sustainable only if certain costs that competitors had to bear were, for this operation, either absent or substantially reduced. The specific cost in question, as Holmes worked through the implication, was the cost of compliance, the cost, in time and money and documentation, of meeting the various regulatory and customs requirements that governed the commodity trade. An operation that had found a way to avoid these costs had, by definition, found a way to operate outside the regulatory framework, and the specific shape of its pricing advantage told Holmes, with considerable precision, where in the chain of compliance the evasion was concentrated. Watson had followed this reasoning with the combination of effort and reward that characterized his engagement with Holmes's more technical deductions. The effort of tracking a chain of logic through a domain of knowledge that was not his own native territory, and the reward of arriving at a conclusion that was, once arrived at, clear and convincing. He had asked, as they were leaving Trevithick's house, whether this pricing analysis was something that could be used directly as evidence, and Holmes had said that it could not, in its current form. It was background, not foreground, the kind of information that gave the foreground its meaning but that did not itself constitute proof of anything. Its use was in the direction it gave to further inquiry, in the specific area of the compliance chain it pointed toward, which was precisely the area that the shipping records Watson had subsequently examined had revealed to be the location of the discrepancies. The connections between these early days of patient inquiry and the later, more dramatic developments of the investigation were, Watson reflected afterward, the connections that most clearly demonstrated the essential nature of Holmes's method. the way in which each element of the work depended on all the others, the way in which a morning spent in the records of the Bermondsey Tanners Association led, through a chain of inference and verification, to the specific evidence of a warehouse at midnight. This was not a demonstration that Holmes's method was magical or that his intelligence was supernatural. It was a demonstration that the combination of genuine knowledge, methodical observation, and the willingness to pursue implications wherever they led, applied consistently and without shortcuts over a sufficient period, produced results that no other method could reliably produce. Watson had been thinking about this, during the long afternoons of the preparatory days, in relation to the question of what he was doing, what his own contribution was, in this and in the many other investigations he had participated in. He was not under any illusion that he was Holmes's intellectual equal in the specific qualities that made Holmes's investigations possible. He had a good mind and a good observer's eye and a good doctor's understanding of the human body in health and illness, but he did not have Holmes's analytical brilliance, his encyclopedic memory, his ability to form and hold multiple complex hypotheses simultaneously and to evaluate new evidence against all of them at once. What he had was something different and, in its own way, as important. A quality of reliable practical intelligence, a steady capacity for patient observation and accurate record-keeping, the specific combination of a physician's trained attention to physical detail and a soldier's trained capacity for sustained action under pressure, and, perhaps most importantly, a quality of honest response to events that served as a kind of check on Holmes's tendency toward the aesthetic seductions of a particularly elegant theory, the way that Watson's honest puzzlement about something that didn't quite fit was often the signal that something important had been missed. Holmes had said this to Watson once, in one of their conversations of unusual frankness, and Watson had been grateful for it not because it was flattering but because it was accurate, and because its accuracy gave him a clearer understanding of what he was doing and why it mattered. He was not the detective's sidekick, in the diminishing sense that word implied. He was the detective's complement, the quality that kept the detective's extraordinary intelligence from becoming its own trap, and that grounded the investigation's flight of inference in the specific, material, human reality it was ultimately about. Holmes had once told Watson that London was the only city in the world that repaid unlimited investigation. That it was, in its complexity, its contradictions, its simultaneous antiquity and modernity, its juxtaposition of the enormously wealthy and the desperately poor, its layering of visible surface upon invisible substrate, a city that had been in the business of concealment since before recorded history and that consequently offered the professional investigator both an inexhaustible supply of material and an equally inexhaustible supply of the specific challenge of penetration. He had said this not in the spirit of a man making a complaint but in the spirit of a man acknowledging a profoundly satisfying professional circumstance, and Watson had understood it in exactly that spirit, as a statement of vocation, as an articulation of the relationship between a man of extraordinary analytical intelligence and a city that had been, as if by design, made exactly adequate to exercise it. The London of the Scarlet merchant investigation was, in Watson's recollection, particularly vivid in these terms. The specific combination of districts the investigation had moved through, the commercial gravity of Mincing Lane, the industrial antiquity of Bermondsey, the governmental weight of Whitehall, the social precision of Kensington and Belgravia, the working-class density of the South Bank with its warehouses and its wharves and its public houses and its very old streets, was a cross-section of the city that displayed, in compressed form, almost the full range of its social and economic complexity. Moving between these districts in the course of an investigation was moving through time as well as space, moving between worlds that existed simultaneously and that intersected at points of extraordinary consequence. Points like the relationship between city commerce and riverfront industry, between respectable philanthropy and organized criminal enterprise, between the managing of appearances and the concealing of realities. Watson had always valued, as one of the incidental gifts of his association with Holmes, the quality of access the investigation gave him to London in its full variety. His own life, without Holmes, would have been confined to a much narrower range of the city's geography and social spectrum, the world of middle-class professional men, of his practice and his club and his domestic arrangements, the world that Victorian professional life defined and within which it was perfectly possible to spend an entire life without ever feeling its specific limitations. With Holmes, that world expanded to include everything. the highest reaches of government and the lowest reaches of the criminal underworld, the great houses of Belgravia and the public houses of Bermondsey, the offices of city merchants and the yards of Bermondsey tanners, and this expansion was not merely interesting but humanly valuable, the kind of knowledge of one's own city that a man gains only by moving through it with eyes open and mind engaged. The specific knowledge that the Scarlet merchant investigation had given Watson of Bermondsey. Its streets, its trades, its social texture, its specific and ancient relationship with the river, was knowledge he returned to frequently in subsequent months, seeing it as a resident of the larger city who now had a particular corner of it in unusually sharp focus. He had gone back to Bermondsey twice after the case's conclusion, on errands that were both genuine and slightly contrived, and had found that the district looked different to him now. Not better or worse, but more fully seen, its surface less opaque because he had been, however briefly, behind it. The passage where Far had been found was, on these return visits, completely unremarkable, cleaned of whatever traces the investigation had attended to, returned to the quiet impersonality of a back street that served its neighborhood without ever being noticed by the wider city. The warehouse walls still bore the marks that Holmes had examined with his lens and his measure, though they were already beginning to be obscured by the general weathering of the masonry, and within a year or two they would be indistinguishable from the hundreds of other marks that the passage's walls had accumulated over the decades. The gas lamp that had not been working on the night of Far's death had been repaired, and cast its small, steady illumination over the entrance to the passage in the specific quality of Victorian gaslight that Watson found, in certain moods, the most beautiful thing the city produced. A warm, golden, slightly imperfect light that gave everything it fell on a quality of both definition and mystery, making the cobbles and the brickwork and the occasional human figure at once more solid and more strange, more present and more uncertain. Watson stood under this lamp on his second return visit and allowed himself to reconstruct, for several minutes, the scene as Holmes had described it. The night, the fog, the cold, the figure of Far arriving in the passage and whatever had awaited him there, and found that the reconstruction produced, as such reconstructions always did for him, a specific quality of sadness that had nothing romantic about it, just the plain human sadness of a life ended in the wrong place at the wrong time for reasons that need not have led there. The October that began the investigation was followed, of course, by the November and December of its aftermath and resolution, and then by the winter's closing and the spring's opening and the long progression of seasons that carried the city through its annual transformation. The fog lifting in March, the first tentative warmth of April, the particular quality of London in May when the gardens and parks that were the city's lungs briefly reasserted their presence in the general grey and commerce, and the city had, for a few weeks, a quality of lightness and colour that surprised even the most accustomed residents. Watson walked through this progression of seasons with the heightened awareness of a man who has recently been reminded, by a case involving death and its prevention, of the specific value of the ordinary pleasures. The warmth of spring after a cold winter, the light on the Thames on a clear afternoon, the sounds of a city going about its business in the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely precious way of a city that has not, on this particular day, provided any occasion for the investigation of extraordinary events. Holmes had observed, during one of their Baker Street evenings in the early part of the new year, that the Far case had been notable, from his purely professional perspective, for the quality of the challenge it had presented in its middle stages. The period when the pattern was clear enough to orient the inquiry but not yet clear enough to support confident action, the period that demanded the most sustained quality of judgment about when to push forward and when to consolidate, when to test a hypothesis and when to hold it in reserve. He had made, he acknowledged, several decisions during this period whose correctness he had not been certain of until they were vindicated, and this uncertainty had been, he thought, a useful condition. Not comfortable, but useful, because it had kept him from the specific error of premature certainty that had, in other cases, occasionally led him to push past the point where the evidence should have made him pause. Watson had asked him, in response to this, whether he ever felt, not merely thought, but felt, in the emotional rather than the analytical sense. The weight of the decisions he made in this uncertain middle period, the awareness that a wrong decision might mean a guilty person escaped justice, or an innocent person was implicated, or someone who was in danger failed to receive the protection that an earlier or differently directed intervention might have given them. Holmes had considered this with unusual care and had said that yes, he felt this weight, though the feeling was not accessible to him in the form that most people experienced as emotion, the agitation of the surface, the disruption of normal function, but rather in the specific quality of attention he brought to the decision when the weight was present, the additional focus and care that the awareness of consequence produced in him. The weight was real, he said, and it was felt, but it was processed in a way that made it useful rather than debilitating, converted from the raw form of anxiety into the refined form of additional care. Watson had found this observation, as he found many of Holmes's more personal observations, both illuminating and slightly unsettling. Illuminating because it was accurate, unsettling because it described a quality of emotional processing so different from his own that it required a genuine effort of imagination to inhabit. His own emotional experience of the investigation's uncertain middle stages had been considerably less disciplined and considerably more disruptive of normal function. He had slept poorly, had been distracted at his practice, had found himself returning repeatedly to the case in the way that an unresolved problem returns to the mind despite one's efforts to set it aside. He had managed this in the ordinary way of managing it, with the combination of the active work Holmes directed him toward and the disciplined preservation of the normal routines that gave life its structure when the extraordinary events tended to dissolve structure altogether. But he had been aware, throughout the investigation, of the weight of consequence in the direct and unrefined form that Holmes had described as the raw form of anxiety, and he had not converted it into anything more useful than the motivation to do his job as well as he could. This was, in the end, enough. The investigation had been successful not because of anything dramatic but because the people conducting it had done their jobs, consistently and carefully, and the accumulated product of that consistent, careful work had been sufficient to the task. This seemed, to Watson, the important lesson. Not the lesson of genius, which was an exceptional condition and not generally available, but the lesson of thoroughness, which was available to everyone who was willing to pay the price of the sustained application it required. Holmes would not have expressed it this way. He would have said that thoroughness without the analytical capacity to know what one was looking for was, in the end, just diligence, and that diligence alone, however admirable in its way, was not sufficient to investigations of this kind. The analytical capacity was not separable from the thorough application of it, the int. Legends and the method were not two things but one thing, and the one thing produced the result. Watson accepted this, as he accepted most of Holmes's assessments of their respective contributions to the work, because it was accurate in the way that mattered, which was the way that served the work's objectives rather than the way that served any individual's self-regard. He had never been particularly interested in the attribution of credit. He had been interested in the outcome, and the outcome, in the Scarlet merchant case, had been what it should have been. The spring had come and gone, and the summer had followed it, and the city had moved through its cycle, and Baker Street had maintained its character through all of it. The accumulated intelligence of Holmes's life's work growing in its index volumes, the cases succeeding each other with the rhythm of a city that never quite settled into the peacefulness its more optimistic inhabitants occasionally imagined it might, and Watson's chronicles growing alongside the index in the specific complementary relationship that their different characters dictated. Holmes recorded the facts and the method, Watson recorded the experience. The quality of being present while the method operated, the texture of the days in which the facts were assembled, the human reality in which the analytical work was embedded. Neither account was complete without the other, and the two together were the record of something that Watson, in his most private and honest moments, recognized as genuinely remarkable. Not the individual cases, however brilliant their resolution, but the sustained, long-term project of attending to the world as it actually was, with all the resources available, and doing so consistently, year after year, in the service of the specific and irreplaceable value of knowing the truth. Outside Baker Street, London continued. The fog would return in October, as it always did. And the city would provide, as it always had, the next occasion for the exercise of the one thing that made the fog, and the crime it concealed, and all the other vast complexities of the Victorian metropolis, ultimately not mysterious but known. The sustained, patient, brilliant, human attention of the man who lived at 221B, Baker Street and who had dedicated his remarkable existence to the proposition that everything, in the end, could be understood, and that the understanding of it was worth every year it cost. But some considerable time later, when the legal proceedings had been concluded and the various parties had arrived at whatever position their various circumstances had assigned them, he wrote it with the usual discipline he brought to such accounts, the effort to be accurate without being merely chronological, to preserve the essential character of events without distorting it in the service of narrative convenience, to give Holmes his full due without making him into something he was not, which would have been both a disservice to the man and an inaccuracy in the record. What Watson valued most, in retrospect, about the Scarlet merchant case was not its dramatic elements, which were, by the standards of Holmes's more celebrated investigations, relatively restrained, but its exemplary quality, its demonstration of the method in operation across a sustained period and in response to a challenge of genuine complexity. The case had required, from its beginning to its conclusion, not a single brilliant insight but a sustained series of them, each one smaller than it might have appeared in isolation and each one necessary for what followed, a quality of progressive and cumulative illumination that Watson thought was, in fact, more characteristic of Holmes's actual practice than the sudden, dramatic revelations that his more superficial admirers tended to imagine. There had been, in the course of it, several moments of genuine uncertainty, moments when the evidence was ambiguous, when the interpretation was contested by the facts available, when the next step was not obvious even to Holmes. Watson had tried to be honest about these moments in his account, because he believed that the honest representation of uncertainty was not a diminishment of Holmes's achievement but a part of it. The achievement lay precisely in the navigation of uncertainty with the right combination of openness to revision and commitment to proceeding, and this was not a quality that was honored by pretending that the path had always been clear. He had also tried to be honest about the human cost of the investigation, not simply the cost afar, which was the most obvious, but the subtler costs to the other people caught in the geometry of the crime. Miss Vane's disrupted professional security, Calloway's enforced confrontation with the full extent of what he had partially known and partially chosen not to know, the various minor figures in the organization whose participation had been limited and whose understanding had been limited with it, and who now faced consequences that were, in legal terms, proportionate to their involvement but that in human terms were considerably more complex. Watson was not a sentimentalist about crime and its consequences, he had seen too much of both to be, but he was a physician, and the physician's instinct was always to register the full extent of the damage, not merely its legally relevant portions. Holmes would not, Watson was certain, have described the case in these terms. For Holmes, the relevant account was the evidentiary one, what had been established, how it had been established, what the method had produced. The human dimensions were real but not, in his view, the primary subject of a professional account of a criminal investigation. Watson had always taken the complementary view that the evidentiary account was incomplete without the human one, that the case existed not in the abstract space of pure reasoning but in the concrete reality of specific people with specific lives that had been altered by specific events, and that an account that ignored this concreteness was, whatever its other merits, an incomplete account. This difference of emphasis between them was, Watson thought, both the friction and the fuel of their collaboration. The way in which their different orientations toward the same material produced, together, something that neither produced alone. Holmes's precision held Watson's sympathy honest. Watson's sympathy gave Holmes's precision its human context and significance. The partnership was, in this respect, one of the more successful arrangements Watson had encountered in a life that had given him considerable opportunity to observe human partnerships of all kinds. Successful precisely because it was a partnership of differences rather than of similarities, because each brought to it something the other lacked and genuinely needed. The year turned, as years do, without particular ceremony in Baker Street. January brought new cases, and February brought a particularly difficult one that consumed Holmes's attention for 3 weeks, and by the spring the Scarlet merchant investigation had taken its place in the accumulation of resolved cases that formed the background of their work together, still available for reference, still occasionally relevant when a new inquiry touched its territory, but no longer the active focus it had been through those October and November months. What remained, for Watson at least, was the image with which he returned most frequently in his private recollections of the case, the moment in the Bermondsey passage on that first morning, when Holmes had stood at the spot where Farr's body had been found and looked at the marks on the warehouse wall with a stillness and a quality of attention so complete that the world around it, the smells of the tanneries, the sound of the river, the cold October air, seemed, for those few minutes, to organize itself around his concentrated gaze, to orient itself to the specific quality of attention he was bringing to a very small area of an ancient brick wall and to what the marks on that wall were prepared to say to anyone with the intelligence and patience and commitment to listen. That image, for Watson, contained what was most essential about Holmes. Not the brilliance, not the knowledge, not even the method in its technical specifics, but the quality of presence he brought to the world, the willingness to be fully there, fully attentive, fully committed to the possibility that what was in front of him contained something real and important that most people's more casual passage through the world had missed. It was, when Watson thought about it, a kind of respect. Not merely an intellectual practice but a moral one, a form of taking seriously the reality of things and of people, a refusal of the shortcuts and elisions that comfort and habit and the pressure of ordinary life perpetually encourage. The city went on, as it had always gone on, making its noise and its smoke and its money and its crime and its neighborhoods and its weather, indifferent to the specific attentions of any single pair of eyes moving through it. Holmes went on too, as he had always gone on, watching, reading, waiting, thinking, and being always, in the deepest sense, ready. And Watson went on beside him, recording what he could, understanding what he could, and being grateful, in the quiet way of a man who has been given the best part of his professional life by an association whose full value he could probably not have articulated on demand but which he felt, in the marrow of the matter, to have been exactly the right thing, in exactly the right company, in the right city at the right time. The fog would come again, as it always did. And Holmes would be waiting for it.